The sun was just beginning to set when we arrived at the campsite. My friends and I had planned this trip for weeks, eagerly waiting for a break from our usual routines. The weekend was supposed to be a chance to disconnect, enjoy nature, and make some good memories. The air was cool, crisp with the scent of pine and damp earth. We unloaded the gear, setting up the tents, unpacking sleeping bags, and gathering wood for the fire. Everything was going according to plan, but the deeper we went into the woods, the more I began to feel something off. At first, I brushed it off, telling myself it was just the excitement of being out in nature. But as the evening wore on, it became harder to ignore. The campfire crackled as we sat around it, roasting marshmallows and chatting about the usual things: work, relationships, plans for the future. But there was this unease hanging in the air, like the forest was watching us. It wasn't anything specific, just an overwhelming sense of being observed, of not being as alone as we should have been. I caught myself glancing over my shoulder more than once, but each time, I found nothing. As darkness settled in, the sounds of the forest grew louder, more distinct. The chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves in the wind, the distant calls of nocturnal creatures. But amidst all that, there was something else, something quieter. I couldn't place it at first, but there was a faint, almost imperceptible sound coming from the trees just outside our campsite. It wasn't an animal, at least not one I recognized. It wasn't the wind either. It was something deliberate, a rustle of movement, subtle, calculated. I wasn't the only one who heard it. One by one, my friends fell silent, their eyes scanning the tree line. We all knew something was wrong, though none of us said it out loud. We tried to laugh it off, shrugging it off as nothing. Maybe it was an animal, maybe it was the wind, maybe it was nothing at all. But deep down, we all felt it, the tension in the air, the creeping sense that we weren't alone. As the night wore on, we huddled closer to the fire. The flames flickered and danced in the chilly night air, casting long shadows on the ground. The shadows seemed to shift and stretch unnaturally, and every crackling sound from the fire made me jump. I kept glancing into the woods, half expecting something, or someone, to emerge from the darkness. The firelight cast eerie shapes across the forest, and the shadows seemed to shift and move of their own accord. My heart pounded in my chest, my hands growing clammy. I wasn't sure if it was fear or just the adrenaline of being out here, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. We were far from civilization, miles away from the nearest house or town. Our only connection to the outside world was our phones, which we had left in the tents, away from the fire. There was no way to call for help if anything went wrong. That thought alone made me feel more vulnerable than I had ever felt before. The wind picked up, rustling the trees, and the fire crackled louder. That's when I heard it again. The faint sound of movement, just beyond the edge of the firelight. This time it was closer. I stiffened, my breath catching in my throat. I glanced at my friends, but they were all staring into the darkness as well. No one spoke, but I could see the same unease on their faces. We all felt it. For a moment, everything was still. No wind, no rustling, no sounds from the forest, just the crackling of the fire and our own breathing. Then, the sound came again, closer this time, unmistakable. Someone or something was out there. I stood up quickly, my heart racing, and grabbed the nearest flashlight. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice shaky. Everyone nodded, their eyes wide, their faces pale. We all stood up, our gazes fixed on the dark tree line, waiting for something, anything to emerge. Then we saw it, a figure, a shadow, tall and thin, moving just inside the tree line. It wasn't a person, at least not anyone we recognized. It wasn't an animal either, not anything I had ever seen before. It was humanoid in shape, but its movements were jerky, almost unnatural. The figure stopped for a moment, then stepped into the open, just beyond the reach of the firelight. We froze, all of us too terrified to move. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it someone playing a prank? No, the figure was too far out to be one of us. And its movements were too erratic, too deliberate. This was no prank. This was something real, and it was getting closer. My heart pounded in my chest, my breathing shallow and rapid. I didn't know what to do. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. We were out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by miles of wilderness. No one would hear us if we screamed. The figure moved again, stepping closer to the firelight. I could see more details now. Its shape was wrong, twisted almost. It was as if its body was stretched, its limbs too long, too thin. Its face, if it had one, was hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on us, watching us with an intensity that sent a chill through my entire body. I don't know how long we stood there, frozen in place, unable to look away. The figure was so close now that I could almost make out the details of its form. It wasn't wearing any clothes, its skin pale and smooth, almost sickly looking. Its limbs were unnaturally long, and its hands, those hands were twisted, with fingers too long, fingers that seemed to bend in the wrong directions. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stepped back into the shadows, disappearing into the darkness. We were all left standing there, breathless, wide-eyed, too terrified to move. The fire crackled, the wind picked up again, and the sounds of the forest returned to normal. But none of us spoke. We couldn't. We all felt the same thing, that overwhelming sense of danger, the knowledge that something was out there watching us. We gathered our things quickly, packing up the tents and supplies, not caring that it was late and the night had grown colder. We didn't speak as we worked, the only sound the rustling of sleeping bags and the frantic movement of our hands. We didn't stay long enough to finish packing everything. We just grabbed what we could and ran. We didn't stop until we reached the car, out of breath and wide-eyed, our minds racing with the same thoughts. What had we seen? What had been out there with us? Was it a person? An animal? Something else entirely? We never went back to that campsite. We never talked about it again. But the memory of that night, the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, will stay with me for the rest of my life. And I can't help but wonder if we were the only ones out there in the woods that night. It was supposed to be just a weekend getaway, a chance to escape the hustle of daily life, to enjoy the fresh air, the sounds of nature, and the warmth of a campfire under the stars. My friends and I had been planning this camping trip for months, ever since the winter months began to drag on, leaving us longing for the outdoors. The plan was simple: pack our gear, drive out to the woods, set up camp, and spend 2 nights in a tent, cooking over a fire, telling stories, and maybe hiking in the mornings.
No distractions, no worries.
Just us and the wilderness. The drive was long, but the weather was perfect. Sunny with a cool breeze that had us rolling down the windows and feeling the rush of air as we left the city behind. We chose a campsite a few hours outside of town, tucked deep into the woods, accessible only by a gravel road that seemed to disappear into the trees. We had been there before, but it had been years since we last camped in this area. We didn't expect any surprises, really. This place had always been quiet, peaceful, but we quickly realized that nature, despite its beauty, had a way of being unpredictable. We arrived in the late afternoon, the sun just beginning to dip low enough to give the sky that golden, almost surreal glow. We set up camp in an open clearing near a small creek. The ground was a little uneven, but it was peaceful. The sound of water flowing over rocks was calming. The trees surrounding us were tall and dense, their canopies thick with leaves that rustled with every gust of wind. The air smelled fresh, pine, dirt, a little dampness from the creek. As we unpacked our gear and began assembling the tent, I felt a strange sensation, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It was like a slight discomfort, an itch at the back of my mind, but I brushed it off. We were here to relax, not to think too much. We made a fire, lit it up with some matches, and as the flames grew, we sat around it, laughing and chatting. It felt like any other camping trip. Night fell quickly. The fire crackled, casting a warm glow on our faces, and the shadows of the trees stretched long and dark around us. We roasted marshmallows, cracked open some beers, and told stories. Mostly dumb stuff, trying to make each other laugh. But there was a moment just before we called it a night when I noticed something odd. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement in the trees, a shadow moving quickly, almost too quickly to be natural. At first, I thought it was just a deer or maybe some other animal, but the movement didn't seem right. It didn't fit the rhythm of the forest. I looked around, but no one else seemed to notice. Maybe it was just a trick of the firelight. I shook it off, telling myself it was nothing. Still, I couldn't ignore that strange feeling creeping back into my chest. I made a mental note to be more aware of my surroundings the next day, but for the moment, I decided to focus on the fire, on my friends, and on the night. We finished up our drinks, doused the fire, and retreated to our tents. The night was quiet, save for the usual sounds of the forest, crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustle of branches in the wind. I tried to sleep, but something felt off. It wasn't the cold. I was warm enough in my sleeping bag. It wasn't the discomfort of the ground beneath me either. It was something deeper, like a sense of being watched, a creeping sensation that I couldn't shake. The darkness outside seemed heavier somehow, thicker than usual, pressing in on me. At some point, I drifted into a restless sleep, but around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a noise, soft at first, like a crack of a twig breaking. I laid still, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. I was sure I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps, light but purposeful, moving just outside the tent. My first thought was that it was probably an animal, a bear or maybe a raccoon. But the more I listened, the more I realized that these footsteps weren't animal-like. They were too deliberate, too close together. It sounded like someone, maybe someone walking in boots. My mind raced. I wasn't supposed to be paranoid. This was supposed to be a peaceful trip, just like every other time we'd gone camping. But there was something unsettling about this. I quietly reached for my flashlight, slowly unzipping the tent just a tiny bit. I peered out into the darkness, my breath held tight in my throat. The forest was still. Nothing. No movement. Could have been the wind. I convinced myself it was nothing, but the unease wouldn't leave me. The rest of the night passed in fitful, interrupted sleep. I barely managed to get any rest at all. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I could hear something out there in the woods, watching, waiting. By morning, I was exhausted and on edge. When I crawled out of the tent, the first thing I noticed was that the fire we had put out the night before was now relit. The logs were burning again, faintly glowing red. No one else had gotten up to restart the fire. That was strange. We all agreed that no one had touched it after we went to sleep. We had doused it thoroughly, made sure it was out. But there it was, burning, as if someone had stoked it in the middle of the night. Did anyone restart the fire? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. My friends looked at each other, confusion written on their faces. No one had. We couldn't explain it. But the oddness of the situation only added to the unease that had been gnawing at me since the previous night. We didn't talk about it much, though. We were too tired, too eager to move on with our trip. We decided to pack up our gear and take a hike, thinking the fresh air and exercise would help clear our minds. We hiked deeper into the forest, following a trail that twisted and turned through dense thickets. The further we went, the more isolated we became. The path started to narrow, and the trees grew denser, their branches reaching out like arms. It was beautiful in its own way, but there was a growing sense that something wasn't quite right. I noticed that the birds had stopped chirping, and the usual forest sounds seemed to be muffled, like the air itself was heavy. Then we found something. It was a small, old shack, barely visible through the trees. It was falling apart, its wooden walls gray and weathered by time. We weren't expecting it. We hadn't seen any signs of human activity on the trail. We walked closer, curiosity getting the better of us. As we reached the door, I felt an odd chill crawl up my spine. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something about the shack felt wrong. We pushed open the door. It creaked loudly, almost as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. Inside, the air was stale, the floor covered in dust. There were remnants of old furniture, broken chairs, a rusty stove in the corner. Nothing in there seemed to suggest that anyone had lived here recently, but there were marks on the walls, strange symbols scratched into the wood, as though someone had been carving something into the surfaces. We spent only a few minutes inside, enough to feel uncomfortable. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't supposed to be there, that someone, maybe something, had been watching us. We left quickly, deciding it wasn't worth lingering. As we turned back toward the trail, I noticed something strange. There, at the edge of the woods, standing between two trees, was a figure. A man, or at least the shape of a man. He was tall, wearing dark clothes, and his face was hidden in shadow. He didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. He just stood there, watching us. We froze. I could hear my friend's breathing, shallow and rapid. My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to shout, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The man didn't react, didn't seem to care that we were there. After what felt like an eternity, he slowly turned and disappeared into the trees. We didn't say anything, but we all knew something wasn't right. We didn't go back to the campsite. Instead, we made the decision to pack up and leave. We didn't need to talk about it. We all understood. We were done. Whatever was out there, whatever had been watching us, we weren't sticking around to find out. The drive back home was quiet. No one spoke much, each of us lost in our thoughts. I couldn't shake the image of the man standing in the woods. Had we imagined it? No, we all saw him. It was real, but we'd made it out, and that's all that mattered. We learned that sometimes the woods are meant to be left alone, that some places aren't as peaceful as they seem, no matter how inviting they may appear at first. And whatever had been out there in the forest, it stayed out there, far from us, in the shadows where it belonged. We never spoke of it again, but we all knew that we'd never return to those woods. Not ever. And that was enough. We were safe, and that's all we could ask for. I never liked camping, not really, but when my friends planned a weekend trip to the woods, I didn't want to be the one to sit it out. I mean, it's just a weekend, right? A couple of days in nature, away from the distractions of daily life. I could handle that. I thought it would be fun at first. We picked a spot far from the usual campsites, some remote area known for its beauty and tranquility. The kind of place people talked about when they wanted to sound like they were really into the whole getting away from it all thing. It was supposed to be peaceful, quiet, and a perfect escape from the chaos of our busy lives. We hiked for hours to get there. It wasn't an easy trek. Steep trails, rocky terrain, and the air getting thinner as we moved deeper into the forest. But we were used to this kind of stuff, or so we thought. By the time we finally reached the clearing where we'd set up camp, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the trees. Setting up the tent took longer than expected, and by the time we were finished, it was getting dark. The fire pit was ready, though, so we gathered around the fire and started cooking dinner. It was just your typical camping food: hot dogs, marshmallows, and cans of beans. Nothing fancy, but it was enough to fill us up. I remember the way the forest felt that night. There was a stillness to it, an unsettling quiet that I couldn't quite shake. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the air, but the forest itself felt like it was holding its breath. The breeze had stopped, and the only sounds were the occasional snap of a twig and the distant call of an owl. But even those felt distant, muffled by the thick air that surrounded us. As we sat around the fire, I couldn't help but notice how dark it was.
No streetlights.
No sounds of cars or people, just the deep, enveloping blackness of the forest stretching out around us. For a moment, I felt something like unease, but I shook it off. It was just the darkness, just the wilderness. I was fine, but then I heard it, a rustling in the bushes. It wasn't loud, not at first, just a small sound, like something moving through the underbrush. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But then it came again, and again. This time it was closer. I glanced at my friends. They didn't seem to notice. They were too busy talking and laughing, lost in their own world. But I couldn't stop thinking about the noise. It was too deliberate, not random like an animal rooting around for food. This was something else. I stood up slowly, careful not to alert anyone. My heart started to race as I moved toward the edge of the campfire's light, where the darkness swallowed everything. I peered into the woods, but all I could see were trees, their branches swaying slightly in the wind, casting long, jagged shadows across the ground. The rustling stopped. I waited, straining my ears for any sound. Nothing. For a few moments, all I heard was the crackle of the fire and the soft murmur of my friends talking behind me. But then, I saw it. A figure, just at the edge of the trees, standing completely still. I couldn't make out any features, just the silhouette of a person, tall and thin like a shadow. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching. My heart skipped a beat. I wanted to call out to my friends, but my voice felt stuck in my throat. I felt a chill run down my spine, and for the first time that night, I realized how alone we were in this place. There was no one else around for miles. No other campsites, no other hikers, just us, and whatever that figure was. Before I could react, the figure turned and disappeared into the trees, moving with an eerie grace, like it had been there the whole time, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I stood frozen, unable to move, staring at the spot where it had been. It was then that the sense of unease grew into something more, a tight knot of fear that I couldn't explain. Something wasn't right about this place. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, like an instinct I couldn't ignore. I turned back to my friends, forcing myself to act casual, to pretend like nothing had happened. I sat down again, trying to act normal, but I could feel the sweat on my palms and my heart still pounding in my chest. I needed to shake it off. I didn't want to be the one who ruined the trip with a stupid scare. But that night, sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the rustling again. I kept imagining that figure watching me from the dark, standing just outside the campfire's light. And every time I opened my eyes, the darkness seemed deeper, more oppressive. I finally drifted off in the early hours of the morning. But even then, my dreams were filled with strange images. A figure moving through the trees, a feeling of being watched, and the sound of footsteps crunching on the ground. I woke up several times, disoriented and sweating, only to realize that the night was still there, pressing in on me. When morning came, I didn't feel any better. The forest felt different in the daylight, less threatening, but the unease lingered. I didn't tell my friends about the figure. They would just laugh it off, think I was overreacting. They didn't hear what I heard. They didn't see what I saw. But as the day went on, something changed. It wasn't just the odd feeling I had in my gut. It was the sense that we weren't alone, that something was watching us, I kept seeing things out of the corner of my eye. Shadows moving where there shouldn't be any, figures darting between the trees, just out of sight. It wasn't just me. My friends started to notice, too. That evening, as the sun started to set, we gathered around the fire again. The rustling in the bushes returned, but this time it was louder, more insistent. The sounds were close, much closer than before. And then we heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice. It wasn't clear. It wasn't a shout or a scream, just a low murmur, as if someone was whispering in the dark. It was coming from the direction of the woods, from the same place where I'd seen that figure the night before. My friends didn't hear it, or at least they didn't acknowledge it. They just laughed it off, thinking it was another animal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that we were being hunted. As the night wore on, I found myself staring at the trees, waiting for the figure to appear again. The firelight flickered in the growing dark, casting long, twisted shadows. And then, just as I was starting to let my guard down, I heard it again. The voice, closer this time. But this time, my friends heard it too. They froze, looking around in confusion, trying to locate the source of the sound. The rustling started again, louder now, and we could all hear footsteps moving through the woods, deliberate, slow, like someone was circling our camp. We weren't alone anymore. We huddled together, tense and scared, watching the trees around us. Every little noise felt like a threat, and that's when we heard it. The unmistakable sound of something heavy crashing through the underbrush, heading straight for us. We grabbed whatever we could, flashlights, sticks, anything, and started backing away from the fire. But it was too late. There was no time to react. The figure stepped into the light. It wasn't human, not in the way we understood it. But it wasn't a ghost or anything supernatural either. It was just wrong. Its limbs were too long, too thin, and it moved in jerky, unnatural motions like it didn't belong in the world we lived in. Its eyes, dark and hollow, stared at us, and for a moment, I thought it was going to kill us. But it didn't. It just stood there, watching us, its body twitching slightly, as if deciding whether to approach. And then, without a word, it turned and vanished back into the woods, disappearing into the trees as quickly as it had come. We stood there in stunned silence, not knowing what to do. We didn't talk about it, didn't discuss what had happened. We just packed up our stuff as quickly as we could and left the campsite. We didn't look back. We never went back to that place again. None of us ever spoke about what we saw, not even to each other. It was like it was a shared secret we all agreed to forget. And to this day, I don't know what that thing was, or if it was even real. Maybe it was just the stress of being so far out in the woods, away from everything familiar. But I can't shake the feeling that we weren't just being paranoid. That thing was real, and it was waiting for us. I haven't gone camping since, and I don't think I ever will. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, something simple and easy. Just me, some friends, and a couple of tents in a quiet, remote spot near a forest. We'd been talking about it for weeks. No phone service, no distractions, just fresh air, the sound of nature, and good company. We didn't expect much, honestly. A chance to unwind, tell a few stories around the campfire, and maybe go on a hike or two. It was supposed to be just another camping trip. Nothing more, nothing less. We drove up on Friday afternoon, the kind of day where the sun felt warm but not unbearable. The air was crisp with that perfect spring breeze, and the only sound we could hear was the crunch of gravel beneath the tires. Our plan was simple: set up camp, light a fire, and relax. We'd brought a cooler packed with food, a couple of sleeping bags, and enough beer to keep the night rolling. We weren't looking for adventure. We just wanted to enjoy the peace of being far from everything. The campsite itself wasn't much. There was a small clearing at the edge of the woods, with a few large trees surrounding us. There was a small creek nearby, its water running clear and cold, a perfect spot for refilling water bottles. We set up our tents quickly as the daylight began to fade. We didn't think twice about it when the forest around us seemed unusually quiet. I figured it was just the time of year, the calm before the summer rush when animals were more likely to be hiding than active. As night settled in, we gathered around the campfire. The crackle of the wood was comforting, and the smell of burning pine filled the air. We laughed, shared stories, and watched the flames dance, occasionally casting shadows on the trees. It felt safe, predictable, the kind of night you think you'll remember as peaceful until something shifts. It started with the noise. At first, it was just small things. Twigs snapping in the distance, leaves rustling as if something heavy was moving through the underbrush. It wasn't alarming at first, just the usual sounds of the forest. But then it kept happening. The sounds got closer, like someone or something was moving around the perimeter of our campsite. We kept looking into the dark edges of the trees, half expecting to see a deer or maybe a raccoon, but there was nothing. The forest felt unnervingly still at times, the kind of stillness that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. I wasn't the only one who noticed it. My friends started whispering to each other, exchanging uneasy looks, but no one said anything aloud. We tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just animals, maybe it was the wind playing tricks with the branches. Who knows? We were here to relax, not get paranoid over every noise in the woods. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. It wasn't just the occasional snap of a branch or the rustle of leaves anymore. It was this deep, unsettling silence that would fall over the camp every few minutes. A silence that felt too heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. That's when I noticed the absence of insects. No crickets, no buzzing of mosquitoes, nothing. It was as if the entire ecosystem around us had gone mute. Maybe we should go to bed, I suggested, trying to push down the unease I felt creeping up on me. The others agreed, though they didn't seem entirely comfortable with the idea. I figured getting some sleep would help, that maybe tomorrow everything would feel normal again. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and tried to settle in. But sleep wasn't easy to come by. I kept hearing things, soft thuds, dragging sounds, and the occasional shuffle of footsteps just beyond the edge of the campfire's glow. Every time I heard something, I would lie still, holding my breath, hoping it was just my imagination. At one point, I could have sworn I heard a low, raspy breath right next to my tent. My heart slammed against my chest. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare make a sound. But after a long, unbearable silence, I heard it again, closer this time. A breathing sound, deliberate and slow. I didn't know what to do. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was probably an animal sniffing around, looking for food. But the longer I listened, the more it felt wrong. It wasn't the kind of breathing I'd expect from a bear or a deer. It was human, but not quite, like something mimicking it, barely. I stayed frozen, staring at the dark fabric of the tent, the breath caught in my throat. Finally, the sound stopped. The world outside seemed to hold its breath along with me. I stayed awake for what felt like hours, but eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a restless sleep. When I woke up the next morning, the sun was shining brightly, casting warm light on the campsite. Everything looked normal. It was as if the strange events of the night had been some sort of bad dream. I didn't say anything to my friends about what had happened. It wasn't like I had proof, and I didn't want to sound crazy. Everyone seemed to be in good spirits, and the morning felt like a fresh start. We ate breakfast together and then decided to go for a hike. The forest was peaceful in daylight. The birds chirped, and there was a gentle rustling of leaves in the wind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but I didn't want to ruin the day for everyone. so I pushed it aside and kept walking. We spent the day hiking along the trails, stopping to take pictures of the views and laughing at each other's bad jokes. But as the day wore on, I noticed something strange. No one else seemed to be around. No other hikers, no campers. It was just us. At first, I didn't think much of it. After all, we were in a pretty remote area. But then, as the day stretched into late afternoon, the silence started to feel a little too heavy again. Like the forest was too quiet. We returned to camp around sunset, and that's when things started to go downhill. The firewood we had left piled neatly by the campfire had been scattered across the clearing. Some logs had even been dragged into the woods. I thought I might be imagining it, but when I pointed it out to the others, they agreed. One of my friends, Matt, had noticed that the creek water looked disturbed, like someone had been splashing around in it, but we hadn't seen anyone else on the trail. We decided to light the fire and sit down to cook our dinner. We talked about the weirdness of the day, but there was an unspoken tension hanging over us. Something wasn't right, but none of us wanted to say it out loud. We didn't want to admit that we were all feeling the same creeping dread, the same sense that we were being watched. That night, the noises returned. It started with the same rustling in the woods, only this time, it felt closer, almost deliberate. Then came the sound of dragging again, the kind of sound you hear when something heavy is being pulled through dirt and leaves. It wasn't an animal. It was something human or close enough to human to feel wrong. We all froze. I felt my stomach twist into knots. My heart raced as I stared into the blackness of the woods, willing my eyes to adjust. But the shadows were thick, and there was nothing to see. Then, just when I thought I couldn't take the silence any longer, we heard a voice. It was low, barely a whisper, but it sent a chill through me. The voice was strange, distorted, like it was coming from far away but at the same time right next to us. That's when I knew we weren't alone. I'd never thought much about camping until I got the invitation. Sure, I'd been on a few short trips as a kid, but nothing serious. When my friend Eric called me up and suggested we head out for a weekend in the woods, something about it just clicked. I was tired, stressed, and in desperate need of some time away from the city. So, despite the nagging feeling I couldn't quite place, I said yes. We chose a remote campsite about a 3-hour drive from the city, far enough into the woods that cell service was spotty at best. We were looking for solitude, peace, and a break from the constant noise. The plan was simple: set up camp, start a fire, eat, talk, and maybe do some hiking. Nothing too intense, just nature and good company. That's what we thought, at least. The first few hours were perfect. The air was cool and fresh, the trees thick and comforting, and the sun filtered through the branches in such a way that it felt almost like a movie. We set up our tents, gathered firewood, and once the sun started dipping, we had a small fire going with some hot dogs and marshmallows on skewers. We didn't talk much at first, just enjoyed the crackling of the fire and the calm of the forest around us. Eric mentioned how quiet it was out here, but I didn't really think anything of it. Quiet was what we came for, after all. But that was when it started. First, I thought it was just the wind. The trees make strange sounds when the breeze picks up, especially in the evening when the temperature drops. I heard what sounded like a branch snapping somewhere off in the distance. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to catch my attention. I glanced at Eric, who was focused on his fire, and shrugged it off. Later, while we were sitting around the fire, the same sound came again, this time closer. The snap of a branch, followed by the rustling of leaves. It made my skin crawl, but I tried not to let it show. Eric was still talking, telling some dumb joke, and I just nodded along, too focused on the noise now to really listen to him. It wasn't the wind this time. It was something else, something moving. I stood up, telling Eric I needed to stretch my legs. I walked to the edge of the camp, where the light from the fire barely reached, and strained my eyes, trying to see through the trees. The sounds had stopped, but the feeling of being watched didn't. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and I swear, for a moment, I could feel something out there, hidden just beyond the tree line, waiting. I couldn't explain why, but I knew something was wrong. Something wasn't right. I forced myself to relax and return to the fire. Eric was still there, unaware of the creeping unease I was feeling. He didn't seem bothered by the strange noises. He shrugged when I asked if he'd heard anything unusual. "Probably a deer or something," he said casually, as if that was the simplest answer in the world. The night wore on, and the sounds seemed to fade. The fire flickered low, and Eric was already nodding off in his chair, a half-eaten marshmallow dangling from his fingers. I was wide awake, though, staring into the glowing embers, feeling the tension coil tighter and tighter in my chest. It wasn't until later, when I had to step away to pee, that the real fear set in. I walked away from the camp, careful not to trip over the uneven ground. The air was cooler now, and the moon had risen high, casting eerie shadows on the forest floor. I reached a small clearing a little ways away and relieved myself, trying to keep my eyes on the dark woods around me. I'd seen a few wildlife documentaries in my time and knew that bears and other predators could be lurking in places like this. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that I was fine. But then I heard it. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. The sound of footsteps, crunching against the dry leaves. Slow, measured, not the kind of sound a deer or squirrel would make. These footsteps were heavier, closer. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The hairs on my arms stood on end. I was no longer alone. I turned, instinctively moving back toward the campsite, but the footsteps followed. It was as if someone, or something, was walking just behind me, keeping the same pace, matching my movements. I could feel the sweat beading on my forehead, my breath quickening. I told myself to stay calm. It was just a person, maybe another camper, maybe a hiker passing through. But as I turned to look over my shoulder, I saw nothing. The trees were silent, no movement, just the cold moonlight filtering through the branches. I picked up my pace, trying not to break into a full run, but the footsteps quickened too. The crunching leaves behind me grew louder, closer. Panic surged through me, and I turned around again. This time, I almost fell over as I stumbled backward. Nothing. The path was empty. I didn't stop to wonder how or why. I ran. I could hear my own breath in my ears as I sprinted back to the camp, my heart hammering in my chest. The firelight flickered in the distance, a small beacon of safety. I reached it in seconds, almost tripping over my own feet as I dove into the clearing. Eric was still asleep in his chair, blissfully unaware of the terror that had just unfolded. I didn't know what to do. Should I wake him up? Should I tell him what had happened? The fear that still clung to me made it hard to think straight, and I was struggling to keep my composure. But then I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, just outside the reach of the firelight. This time I didn't wait. I grabbed Eric by the shoulders, shaking him awake, my voice trembling as I tried to explain. I wasn't sure how much sense I was making, but when I saw the look on his face, confusion mixed with concern, I knew he could see how terrified I was. We didn't speak much after that. We packed up what little we could in a panic, fumbling with the tent, gathering up the essentials. The footsteps hadn't stopped. They circled our camp, moving closer and farther, but always with that same eerie rhythm. The last thing I remember as I threw everything into the car was the sound of leaves rustling behind me. Then, as if the very woods had decided we weren't welcome, the noise suddenly stopped. Complete silence. We left. I don't even know how we managed to get everything packed so quickly. It felt like the forest was holding its breath, watching us as we drove away. When we reached the nearest town, we didn't say much. We didn't need to. The fear we felt was something neither of us could explain, but we both knew it was real. We never went back. I don't know what it was that followed me that night. I don't know what made those footsteps sound so deliberate, so haunting, but I've never felt anything like it before, and I never want to again. The forest wasn't quiet that night. It was waiting, watching, and I was just another intruder. To this day, when I go out hiking or camping with friends, I can't help but think back to that night. Every time I hear a branch snap or a leaf rustle, I feel that cold tingle on the back of my neck, and I know, deep down, that some things are better left unexplored, because sometimes the wilderness holds secrets we're not meant to uncover. And no matter how hard I try to forget, I'll never forget that feeling of being followed, of knowing, without a doubt, that we were not alone. I've been camping in the woods before, but nothing like this. The plan was simple. Just me, my backpack, and some gear for a weekend away from the noise. I didn't expect anything unusual. Just a couple of nights surrounded by trees, with no phone service and nothing to distract me. I arrived late in the afternoon. The sun was sinking behind the trees, casting long shadows across the dirt trail as I set up my tent by the lake. The place looked peaceful, serene even, but I couldn't shake this strange feeling in my gut, like someone was watching me. It didn't help that the forest was eerily silent. No birds, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just quiet, unnaturally quiet. As the evening wore on, I built a fire. The flames crackled, and I roasted a few marshmallows, trying to settle into the night. But the air was thick, heavy even, like the woods were holding their breath. I kept hearing noises in the distance. Branches snapping, the soft thud of something moving through the forest. I tried to tell myself it was just a deer or maybe a raccoon, but it didn't feel right. The sounds were too deliberate, too close. I decided to call it an early night. The darkness had settled fully, and the fire was nothing but glowing embers. I crawled into my sleeping bag inside the tent and zipped it up, trying to ignore the slight panic rising in my chest. And then, just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I heard it, a low guttural sound. Not an animal, not a person, but something else entirely. Came from the woods. The noise was so out of place, so wrong, that my heart skipped a beat. It was a kind of growl, but stretched out, like it was deep in the throat of something that shouldn't be alive. I held my breath, straining to hear any other sounds. There was nothing, just the usual night noises, the rustling of leaves in the wind, the occasional splash from the lake. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a bear, maybe some kind of large animal. I tried to ignore the unease creeping up my spine, telling myself I was just overreacting. But as the night wore on, the noises didn't stop. They got closer, and then at one point they stopped altogether. I stayed awake for hours, eyes wide open, staring into the dark. There was no sleep, not after hearing that sound, not after feeling like something was moving just outside my tent, something big, something with intent. The forest was unnervingly quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I finally made the decision to leave. I packed up everything as quietly as I could, not wanting to alert whatever was out there. It was still dark, but I didn't care. I needed to get out of that campsite. Fast. The hike back to my car was longer than I remembered. The woods felt different in the dark, unfamiliar in ways I hadn't noticed during the day. Every rustle, every crack of a branch made me freeze in place. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Then I heard it again, that low growl, but this time it was closer, much closer. I picked up my pace, nearly breaking into a full sprint. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, and the growl followed me, echoing in the trees around me. It was like whatever it was playing with me, letting me think I could outrun it. I didn't stop running until I saw the faint outline of my car through the trees. My legs were burning, my breath ragged, but I didn't care. I was close, just a little farther. I reached my car, threw open the door, and jumped in, slamming it shut behind me. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for the keys. I could still hear the growl, faint but distinct, from somewhere deep in the woods. I started the engine and drove away, not looking back. By the time I reached the nearest town, I was trembling. My heart was still racing, and every time I thought about that growl, a cold shiver ran down my spine. But as I parked outside a gas station to catch my breath, I realized something I hadn't noticed before. The woods, the silence, the feeling of being watched. It all made sense now. I wasn't being stalked by an animal. No, what I had encountered was something much more unsettling. Something human. Someone had been in those woods with me, watching me, following my every move. That growl? It wasn't an animal. It was a voice, disguised, a warning. And whatever it wasn't done with me yet. I don't know who or what it was, but I know one thing for sure. I'm not going back to that campsite. Not ever. I never thought camping could be anything other than peaceful. I had been on dozens of trips, but something about this one felt different from the start. It wasn't supposed to be anything special. Just me and a buddy heading into the woods for a weekend away from work and responsibilities. We wanted the usual. A campfire, some beers, maybe a couple of fishing rods. It should have been the same as any other trip, but it ended up being a nightmare that I still can't shake. We got to the site late in the afternoon, after a long drive through winding roads that seemed to close in around us the further we went. The woods were dense, and the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the ground. It was still early enough that we figured we had time to set up camp and get a fire going before it got dark. We parked the car at the edge of a clearing and unloaded our gear. The campsite was exactly what you'd expect from a national forest. A few scattered trees, a wide open space, and a fire pit in the middle with a couple of logs around it. We weren't alone. There was a small group of other campers nearby, but they were a good distance away. It was quiet, but not uncomfortable, just the peaceful hum of nature. We set up the tent and started working on the fire. As the night crept in, the forest around us seemed to come alive. You could hear the chirp of crickets, the rustle of leaves in the wind, and the occasional snap of a twig. But something felt off. Maybe it was the wind, which seemed to shift direction every few minutes, or maybe it was the strange quiet that would settle in for a few seconds before the sounds returned. It wasn't quite the calm I was used to. We sat around the fire, beers in hand, talking about anything and everything. The kind of conversation you have when you're trying to forget about the outside world. It was one of those moments where everything felt perfect, even though I could feel my skin prickling, like someone was watching me. But I pushed that feeling aside. It was probably just the dark woods playing tricks on me. The first real sign that something was wrong came when we heard a strange noise coming from the woods. It wasn't the usual nighttime sounds. This was different. At first, it sounded like an animal, maybe a deer or something rustling through the underbrush. But then, it started to sound like something bigger, like footsteps, slow, deliberate, heavy steps moving closer to the campsite. We both stood up, trying to make sense of what we were hearing. Probably just a bear, my buddy said, trying to sound calm, though I could tell he was uneasy. I wasn't so sure. The footsteps didn't sound like the kind of movement a bear would make. It was too steady, too intentional. We grabbed our flashlights and shined them into the woods, scanning for anything that could explain the noise. Nothing, just the trees, the shadows, and the occasional flicker of light from the fire. We waited for what felt like hours, our eyes glued to the darkness, but nothing appeared. Slowly, the air felt thicker, heavier, like it was pressing in around us. We sat back down, trying to convince ourselves that it was nothing. Maybe a deer had wandered through the campsite, or maybe it was just our nerves. After all, it's easy to imagine things when you're alone in the woods at night. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. We stayed by the fire for another hour, the silence growing more uncomfortable with each passing minute. The fire crackled and popped, but the surrounding woods felt unnervingly still. There were no more animal sounds, no more rustling in the leaves, just an oppressive quiet that settled around us. Then we heard it again. This time it was clearer, louder, the unmistakable sound of something heavy walking through the underbrush. But it wasn't just a few steps. It was a long, drawn-out movement, as if whatever it was circling us. Slowly, methodically, I stood up and grabbed my flashlight, my heart pounding in my chest. My buddy looked at me, his face pale. "What the hell is that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. I didn't have an answer. The woods were too dark, too deep for us to make anything out. But I could feel it now. Something was out there, moving just beyond the reach of our lights. We waited in tense silence, the fire casting flickering shadows on our faces. The sound of footsteps came again, but this time it was closer, much closer. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and my stomach dropped. "Maybe we should go back to the car," I suggested, my voice barely a whisper. It was an impulse, a sudden urge to get out of there before whatever was out there made itself known. But before we could even move, the sound stopped. Just like that, the heavy footsteps, the rustling gone. We stood there, frozen, listening. The forest was completely silent now. Too silent. After what felt like an eternity, we finally decided to go back to the car. We grabbed our gear in a rush, tossing everything into the tent without caring about organization. But as we turned to leave, we heard one final noise, a low, guttural growl, echoing from somewhere deep in the woods. We froze again, and this time we didn't move. The growl was like nothing I had ever heard before, deep, vibrating in my bones, and filled with an unnatural malice. It was the sound of something that wasn't supposed to be there. And then, in the silence that followed, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of something heavy crashing through the trees. A sudden snap of branches, a low rumble of movement. Something was coming toward us, and it was fast. We didn't hesitate. We ran. We didn't look back. The only thing I could hear was the pounding of my own feet on the ground, the rush of blood in my ears, and the sound of something large, something predatory, following us just out of sight. We reached the car as fast as we could, jumping in without a second thought. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking, my mind racing. I started the engine and we drove off, not caring that we left everything behind. Our gear, the tent, the fire. It didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was getting out of there, getting away from whatever had been following us. We didn't stop until we were miles away, the trees fading behind us. We sat in silence, both of us staring out the windshield, too shaken to speak. I was scared. Not just scared of the growl, not just scared of the footsteps, but scared because I knew something wasn't right. We had been followed by something that had made no sound at all until it was too late. We eventually found a gas station, and the normal world slowly started to creep back in. People, traffic, lights. It was a far cry from the terrifying wilderness we'd just escaped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching us the whole time. There are no logical explanations, no wild animals,
No hikers.
just a feeling of something in the woods, waiting for us to leave. And we never went back. Not to that spot, not to that forest, not even to the same state. The worst part? I still don't know what it was. But I know one thing for sure, it wasn't human, and it wasn't an animal. and I hope I never find out what it was. I never really understood the draw of camping. My friends had always raved about it. The fresh air, the escape from the hustle and bustle of city life, the chance to reconnect with nature. To me, it always seemed like a hassle. The bugs, the cold at night, and the constant worry about whether I'd forget something important were enough to make me stay at home. But this time, something changed. Maybe it was the promise of getting away from everything, or maybe I was just tired of the same old routine. Either way, I found myself agreeing to go on a weekend camping trip with a group of friends. We picked a remote spot, somewhere deep in the forest that none of us had ever been to before. The kind of place where you couldn't hear cars or people, just the wind rustling through the trees and the sounds of the wild. We left on a Friday afternoon, the sun still high in the sky as we packed our gear into the cars. There were 6 of us in total, 2 couples and my friend Mark, who had insisted on going even though he'd never been camping before. I think he thought it would be an adventure, a way to impress the group. But none of us really knew what we were getting ourselves into. The drive out there was long, the roads winding and narrow as we got further from civilization. The landscape began to change as we passed through small towns, fields, and then thick stretches of woods. The deeper we went, the more isolated it felt. There was something eerie about it. The quiet, the way the trees seemed to close in on the road, blocking out the sun in places. Finally, we reached the trailhead. We parked the cars, grabbed our bags, and began the hike into the woods. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, the kind of smell that makes you feel like you're in a completely different world. It was peaceful at first, just the sounds of our footsteps crunching on the trail and the occasional bird call in the distance. But as we got further into the woods, something started to feel off. The forest was dense, almost oppressive. The trees seemed to stretch on forever, their branches twisting and reaching out like long fingers. It was like we were walking into something much bigger than ourselves, something ancient. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. We reached our campsite just before sunset, a small clearing near a stream with a fire pit already set up. It was the perfect spot, or at least it seemed that way at the time. We set up the tents, gathered some firewood, and got the fire going as the last light of day faded behind the trees. As the night wore on, we sat around the fire, telling stories and roasting marshmallows. The warmth from the flames felt good, and the sound of the crackling wood was comforting. But there was a heaviness to the silence that crept in as the night deepened. The forest around us seemed too still, like it was holding its breath. Mark was the first to mention it. He laughed nervously, looking around. "You guys hear that?" At first, I didn't hear anything, just the wind rustling through the leaves. But then, I heard it too. A faint sound, almost like a low hum. It wasn't constant, but it was there, somewhere in the distance. It wasn't an animal or the wind. It was too rhythmic, almost like something human. "Probably just the wind," I said, trying to shake off the unease. But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. The hum was unsettling, like something was out there in the darkness, just beyond the edge of the firelight. We sat in silence for a while, the only sound being the occasional snap of the firewood. But the hum wouldn't go away. It was still there, faint but persistent. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the trees, but no matter how hard we tried, none of us could pinpoint its source. It wasn't an animal, not anything I'd ever heard before. After what felt like hours, the hum finally faded away. But by then, the mood had changed. We all felt it, that nagging feeling in the back of our minds, the one that tells you something isn't right. It wasn't like we were scared of some ghost or creature lurking in the dark. It was just the feeling that something wasn't as it should be. We all agreed to head to bed early, though none of us really felt like sleeping. I crawled into my tent, trying to push the unease out of my mind. but the sound from earlier still lingered, echoing in my head. The night seemed too quiet after that. The hum was gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I must have finally fallen asleep at some point, because I woke up to the sound of something moving outside my tent. Soft at first, just the rustling of leaves, then louder, like footsteps. My heart raced. I lay still, straining to listen. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something passing by. But there was something about the way it moved, too deliberate, too close to the tent. I held my breath, waiting for the sound to pass. But it didn't. The footsteps came closer, stopping just outside my tent. I could feel the presence there, just on the other side of the thin fabric. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was it one of my friends messing with me? No, it couldn't be. They were all still asleep in their tents, I was sure of it. The air outside was thick and still, like the entire forest was holding its breath with me. My hands were clammy as I slowly reached for the zipper of my tent, trying to move as quietly as possible. My mind screamed at me to stay still, not to open it, but the need to know what was outside was overpowering. I took a deep breath, unzipped the tent just enough to peer out. The campfire was just a faint glow in the distance, casting long shadows across the clearing. I didn't see anything at first. No movement, no shapes lurking in the dark, just the stillness of the night. I was about to zip the tent back up when I saw something. A shadow, just beyond the reach of the firelight, moving between the trees. It was fast, too fast to be a person, too deliberate to be an animal. My blood ran cold. The footsteps had stopped, but the presence was still there, watching. I didn't sleep at all that night. I spent the rest of the hours lying wide awake, my eyes fixed on the entrance of the tent, half expecting something, or someone, to come inside. When morning finally came, I was the first to crawl out of my tent. The others were still asleep, none of them showing any signs of being disturbed by whatever had happened during the night. I didn't say anything, didn't want to sound paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I packed up my things early and told the group I was heading back to the trailhead. It wasn't that I was scared, exactly. It was more that I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of something unseen moving just beyond my vision. The hum from the night before still echoed in my mind, a constant reminder that we hadn't been alone in those woods. The others, of course, thought I was overreacting. They decided to stay another night, but I couldn't. I grabbed my gear, said my goodbyes, and left. I don't know what it was that we heard that night. Could have been a person out there in the woods, though I don't know why they would be so close to our campsite. Maybe it was some kind of animal, something I just didn't recognize, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the hum or the footsteps. It was the silence that followed them. The forest had felt alive, watching, waiting. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I couldn't ignore it. As I walked back to the trailhead, the air around me felt lighter, less oppressive. I couldn't explain it, but it was like the weight that had hung over me for the past 24 hours had finally lifted. When I reached my car, I looked back at the woods one last time. The trees were silent now, as if nothing had happened at all. But I knew better. Something had been out there, something that didn't belong in the stillness of the forest. I never went camping again, and whenever I hear a hum in the distance, I can't help but wonder if it's the forest, calling out, waiting for someone else to listen. I've always loved camping. There's something about the wilderness, the quiet, the smells, the air, that makes me feel like I can finally breathe. Last summer, I decided to go on a solo camping trip to a remote site I had found online. The description sounded perfect. A peaceful lake surrounded by towering trees. No crowds, just nature and a few miles of trails. The kind of place where you could escape from everything. I packed up my gear, set out early, and drove for hours until I reached the edge of the forest. It wasn't exactly in the middle of nowhere, but close enough. No cell service, just the sound of your own thoughts. The hike to the campsite wasn't long, about 2 hours, give or take. The path was narrow, winding through thick woods. The deeper I got, the quieter it became. There were no birds, no animal sounds at all, only the occasional rustling of leaves underfoot. At first, I figured it was just because it was early morning. But even by noon, when I finally reached the campsite, there was a strange, almost unnatural stillness. The lake stretched out before me, shimmering beneath the sun. It was beautiful, just as I'd imagined. I set up my tent on the flat ground next to the water, built a small fire pit, and hung up my hammock between 2 strong trees. That first night was peaceful. I sat by the fire, eating some canned beans and a sandwich, letting the flames crackle and pop. The only sounds were the occasional splash from the lake, likely a fish jumping, and the wind moving through the trees. I felt relaxed, like everything in my life had slowed down. For a brief moment, I forgot about the pressures of work, family, and everything else that weighed me down. It was just me, the forest, and the calm of the lake. But that night, I heard something that I couldn't explain. I was drifting off to sleep, curled up in my sleeping bag, when I heard footsteps. Soft at first, like someone walking carefully on the trail. I froze, listening intently. It didn't sound like the usual forest noises, the scurrying of squirrels or the heavy tread of a deer. These footsteps were deliberate, slow, and human. I sat up quickly, grabbing my flashlight. The beam of light flickered as I swung it toward the entrance of the tent. Nothing, just trees. The night was thick, dark, and quiet once again. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Maybe a bear, or someone else camping nearby. There were other campsites further down the trail, after all. Still, I felt uneasy, so I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I decided to go for a hike to explore the surrounding area. I packed a small bag, took my map, and left my tent. The trail curved along the edge of the lake, where the trees grew taller and closer together. It was beautiful, but something was different this time. The air felt heavier, the trees more oppressive, and the silence unnerving. I kept walking, hoping the sound of my footsteps would keep me grounded. But as the hours passed, I started to feel like I was being watched. I tried to brush it off, but the feeling didn't leave me. It followed me on the trail, and it grew stronger as the day wore on. At one point, I thought I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a figure partially obscured by trees standing still. I stopped in my tracks, heart racing, and turned. Nothing, just the usual undergrowth and shadows. But the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My gut told me something was wrong, though I couldn't pinpoint why. When I returned to my campsite, I felt a wave of relief. But that sense of calm didn't last long. As the sun set, I noticed something odd. My food, which I had securely stored in a hanging bear bag, was gone. The bag had been torn open, and the contents, snacks, canned goods, were nowhere to be found. I thought maybe a bear had gotten to it, but there were no signs of a bear around. The trees and ground were undisturbed. The area around my tent was oddly clean. There were no paw prints, no tracks, no sign of any animal at all. I spent the night on edge, hardly sleeping. I kept hearing things outside my tent. First, it was the distant sound of branches cracking. Then the soft, deliberate footsteps again. Each time, I'd flash my light out into the dark, but I saw nothing. It wasn't until early morning, when I stepped out of the tent to start a fire, that I found something strange. There, just at the edge of the camp, was a trail of footprints. They weren't animal prints, though. These were human-sized, but too large and uneven to be anyone's. And they weren't regular footprints either. There was something off about the way they seemed to drag. They led away from my camp, toward the lake, and then abruptly stopped at the water's edge. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I had no explanation. It could have been someone else hiking through, but there was no reason for them to come so close to my camp. I spent the next couple of days feeling more and more uneasy. The noises kept coming, the footsteps, the sense of being followed. But I never saw anyone. It was like I was losing my grip on reality. Every time I thought I was alone, I wasn't sure anymore. On the third day, I decided I needed to leave. I packed up my things quickly, feeling a wave of anxiety wash over me. But as I was preparing to head back down the trail, I heard something else, a whisper. It came from the trees. Low, barely audible, but unmistakable. It was too soft to make out any words, but the tone made my skin crawl. I froze, my heart pounding. My first instinct was to run, but I knew that wouldn't help. Whatever was out there, it was already too late. I gathered the last of my things and started down the trail, walking fast, not looking back. As I made my way down the narrow path, I kept hearing the whisper. It followed me, just at the edge of my hearing. Then, when I finally reached the parking area, I didn't feel the usual relief. Instead, I was almost terrified to leave. I could hear my own breath, ragged and panicked, as I loaded my gear into the car. When I started the engine and drove away, I felt a strange sense of closure. The silence was deafening, but it was a relief to leave the campsite behind. But even now, as I write this, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me back. I don't know what it was, and maybe I'll never know. The whispers still linger in the back of my mind, and sometimes, when the wind picks up and the trees rustle outside my window, I swear I hear them again. I never went back to that campsite, and I never will. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, just me and my two friends, camping in the woods. We'd planned this trip for weeks. The idea was simple: get away from the noise of the city, pitch our tents by the lake, cook some good food, tell some stories, and just be. No fones, no hash, no interruptions. Just the kind of break we all needed. At least that's how it was supposed to go. We arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon. The sun was dipping behind the trees, and a soft orange glow painted the sky. The air was cool but not cold, and there was a crisp smell of pine all around us. We found a nice spot near the edge of the lake, surrounded by trees. There was a fire pit already set up, and I figured someone had camped there before. It was perfect. My friends and I worked together to set up the tents. It didn't take long, and we had a little campfire going soon after. The light flickered, casting dancing shadows across the trees, and we sat down, sharing a few beers and talking about everything and nothing. There was a calmness to the place, the sound of the fire crackling, the occasional rustle of animals in the woods, and the distant, peaceful sounds of the lake lapping against the shore. For a moment, it felt like everything was exactly how it was meant to be. But as the night wore on, things started to feel off. It was small at first, little things that I couldn't put my finger on. I noticed how quiet it got, like all the usual night sounds had just disappeared.
No frags croaking, no insects buzzing.
Just the wind in the trees and the crackling fire. I told myself it was nothing, just the nature of the woods, right? But then, around midnight, we heard a sound. It wasn't from the animals. It was a distinct noise, footsteps, crunching leaves and twigs, as if someone was walking just beyond the firelight. I glanced at my friends. They'd heard it too. "Who's out there?" One of them whispered, almost to himself, as if saying it out loud would make it real. We all went quiet, straining our ears. It wasn't the sound of an animal, I was sure of that. It was deliberate. Someone or something walking just outside our circle of light. The footsteps didn't come closer, but they didn't retreat either. They just paused. Probably just some other campers, my other friend said, though his voice lacked conviction. But I didn't believe that. We were far from the nearest campsite. It was a good hour's hike to the next area, and no one else had been in sight when we arrived. Still, I didn't say anything. I didn't want to freak anyone out, especially not over nothing. We didn't get much sleep that night. Every time we thought the footsteps had stopped, they would start again, just outside the firelight, like someone was moving around us, watching us, but staying out of sight. My nerves were on edge, but eventually, the noises stopped. We stayed up for hours, talking in hushed voices, too scared to sleep. The next morning, we decided to push through and carry on with the trip. We went fishing at the lake, hoping the fresh air and activity would take our minds off the night before. But even as we joked around, something felt different. It was like we were being watched. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was out there, lurking just at the edge of our vision. We didn't talk about it, but I could tell my friends felt it too. After lunch, we decided to take a short hike around the area. We figured a walk through the woods might calm our nerves and distract us from the weirdness. But as we hiked deeper into the forest, things started to get even stranger. The trees grew denser, and the shadows seemed to get darker, like the sun couldn't quite reach through the canopy. It was hard to see more than a few feet ahead. And then I noticed it. The trail we'd been following had suddenly changed. It wasn't a path we'd walked earlier, and it definitely wasn't one I recognized. The trees around us seemed to shift, and the landscape felt unfamiliar. I stopped and glanced around, wondering if I'd missed something, but I wasn't the only one who noticed. One of my friends stopped too, his brow furrowed. "Are we lost?" he asked. His voice didn't sound like he was joking. "No way," I said, but deep down I wasn't so sure. The forest was vast, and the way it felt now was different from how it had felt when we arrived. We retraced our steps, but the path was gone. In its place was a tangle of underbrush, like the trail had never existed. We tried walking in different directions, calling out to see if we could hear the sound of the lake or our campsite, but nothing. Only the rustling of leaves, the distant call of a bird, and the sound of our own footsteps. It was starting to get dark again, and the panic set in. We couldn't be lost. I tried to convince myself that it was just an illusion, that we had walked too far, but everything felt wrong. There was no comforting sound of the lake anymore, no familiar landmarks. By the time we realized we had no idea where we were, the air was growing colder, and the sky had darkened completely. We knew we needed to get back to camp, but we couldn't remember which way to go. I suggested we try to make it back to the lake. Water was usually a good indicator of direction, and if we could find it, we might be able to follow the shore back to camp. We had no choice but to keep moving. The deeper we went, the more the woods seemed to close in around us. It wasn't the same forest we'd walked through earlier. Now it felt oppressive, claustrophobic. The trees were gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching out like claws. It was as if the forest itself was keeping us there, trapping us. And then we heard it again. Footsteps, not from us, but from somewhere behind us. Quiet at first, but growing louder. I turned around quickly, expecting to see anyone, but there was nothing, just trees. A thick fog had started to roll in, making the night even more disorienting. I felt my heart race. The footsteps were closer now, not from any animal, not the wind, just someone walking. I grabbed my friends, pulling them with me as we broke into a run, following what we hoped was the right direction. My breath was ragged, and my legs burned, but I didn't stop. Every few seconds, I glanced back, half expecting someone, or something, to be right behind us. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the footsteps stopped. The air went still. I stopped running, my chest heaving, and looked around. We were out of breath, terrified, but there was no sign of anyone. We kept walking, slower now, trying to be more careful. The fog had lifted a little, and we could see the outline of the lake in the distance. I couldn't tell if I was relieved or more nervous. The lake meant we were close to camp, but something about the whole situation didn't sit right with me. Eventually, we reached the lake, and from there, we made our way back to our campsite. When we arrived, we found everything exactly as we had left it. The fire pit, the tents, even the half-eaten food we'd left out. It looked peaceful, like nothing had happened at all. It was as if the strange events of the day hadn't even occurred. We didn't talk much that night. We just huddled around the fire, not wanting to break the uneasy silence. But the thing that stuck with me the most was the sound of those footsteps. I couldn't explain it. We weren't imagining it. I knew that for sure. But whatever it was, whoever was out there, it wasn't human. The next morning, we packed up early. We didn't say much. We were all eager to get out of the woods. We drove away from the campsite without looking back, not sure if we'd ever come back. What happened out there was something we'd never truly understand. But one thing was for sure, we were glad to leave it behind. To this day, I don't know what we heard or who was walking out there in the dark. But I've never gone camping in those woods again. I learned that not all spaces in nature are as peaceful as they seem, and sometimes the scariest things are the ones you can't explain. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, just a weekend getaway to unwind, get away from the noise, the grind, the endless emails, and the phone notifications. The kind of trip where you just pitch a tent, make some food over a fire, and let the world fade away for a while. I remember when my friends suggested it. You need to disconnect, they said. Get out of the city. Spend some time in nature. They promised it would be relaxing. I was skeptical, but it sounded good. So, we packed our bags and drove out to a secluded spot by a lake, deep in the woods. I remember the day we arrived. The sun was still high in the sky, and the air smelled fresh, like pine trees and wet earth. The lake looked beautiful, its surface shimmering like glass. We set up our tents, laid out our sleeping bags, and started a fire. We joked and laughed, cooking hot dogs and marshmallows, as the sun slowly set behind the trees. It was a peaceful evening, just the way it was supposed to be. But as the night deepened and the darkness closed in, something started to feel off. At first, I couldn't place it. Maybe it was just the isolation. The campfire crackled and popped, sending sparks into the cold air. But it didn't quite chase away the creeping sensation at the back of my mind. The woods surrounding our campsite were quiet. Too quiet. There were no crickets, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was as if the forest itself had fallen silent, holding its breath. We sat around the fire, sipping on beers and talking about nothing in particular. But my eyes kept wandering toward the edge of the tree line. The shadows seemed darker there, deeper. The firelight flickered, casting strange shapes on the ground. For a moment, I thought I saw something move, just a flicker, like a shadow darting between the trees. I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Eventually, we called it a night. I crawled into my tent, zipped myself in, and tried to sleep. The air was cool, but not uncomfortable. The sounds of the woods outside were starting to creep back in. The occasional rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl. But just as I was starting to drift off, I heard something else. A snap, a twig breaking just outside my tent. I froze, holding my breath, straining to hear more. It was so quiet, I could almost hear my own heartbeat. Another snap, then the unmistakable sound of something moving, slowly, carefully, just outside the tent. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, foraging through the woods. But there was something different about the way it moved. It was deliberate, as if whatever it was trying to be stealthy. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, not daring to move. I didn't want to make a sound, in case whatever it was close enough to hear me. The silence stretched on, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves. Finally, the sound seemed to move away, and I let out a quiet breath of relief. I told myself I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next morning, I woke up to find the others already up, packing up their things. I forced myself to act normal, to pretend like I hadn't been lying awake all night, listening for sounds that didn't make sense. I didn't mention it to anyone, thinking it was just my imagination running wild. But as we began our hike around the lake that morning, I started to notice strange things. Little things at first. Twigs snapped in the distance, but when I looked, there was nothing there. A strange rustling noise came from the bushes, but nothing emerged. I felt like I was being watched, but every time I turned around, no one was there. The others were oblivious, laughing and talking as we walked, not noticing the subtle shifts in the atmosphere. I tried to push my unease aside, but the sensation was growing stronger with every step. At one point, we stopped by a small clearing to rest. I sat down on a fallen log, trying to calm myself. The others went to the edge of the lake to take pictures, and I was left alone, just for a moment. It was then that I noticed something strange. Footprints in the dirt. They were large, too large to belong to any animal I recognized. They were human footprints, but there was something odd about them. The toes were elongated, the prints deep, as though whoever made them had been walking in a hurry, and they led straight into the woods, disappearing into the dense trees. I should have said something. I should have pointed it out, but I didn't. Instead, I kept quiet, pretending I didn't see it. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach as I looked back at the others. They were too far away to hear me if I shouted. My mind raced. Who else could be out here so far from any other campgrounds? Why were the prints so fresh? I felt a chill crawl up my spine, but I did my best to shove it down. That night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep in my tent again. The forest outside felt too close, too alive with things I didn't understand. So I decided to stay by the fire just for a while. The others seemed unfazed, but I was anything but. As the hours wore on, the night grew colder, the fire casting long, dancing shadows across the campsite. I kept glancing into the darkness, expecting to see something move, but nothing ever did. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt heavier now, like the trees were pressing in on us. I thought I saw something flicker at the edge of the firelight. Just a glimpse, but enough to make my heart race. The others laughed, still in good spirits, oblivious to the mounting tension in the air. I felt like an outsider, like I was the only one who could sense that we weren't alone. I should have spoken up. I should have said something, but I didn't. Instead, I kept quiet and sat by the fire, watching the flames dance, too afraid to look away for too long. But as the night wore on, things started to change. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, making the branches creak and groan. The fire crackled, sending more sparks into the air. Then, I heard it again. Footsteps, soft but distinct. They came from the edge of the trees, slow and deliberate, just like before. I stood up, heart pounding, my hands shaking. I didn't know what to do. I turned to the others, but they were too far away, their laughter and chatter masking the sound. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and started scanning the trees, my beam of light sweeping across the dark woods. My heart was racing, and my breath was shallow. There was nothing, just the trees, the shadows, and the silence. But then, in the distance, I saw something. A figure, standing between two trees, half hidden in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the firelight. I froze, my blood turning to ice. It was tall, too tall to be human, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. I couldn't make out its features, but I could feel its eyes on me. I could sense its presence, like it was studying me. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in terror, but it felt like an eternity. The figure didn't move. It didn't need to. I felt it watching me, waiting for something. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I screamed, running toward the others, shouting at them to get inside the tents, to get away from the fire. But when I turned around, the figure was gone. Just like that. No trace. Nothing. We packed up and left that night. No one asked any questions and no one spoke of what happened. Maybe they didn't believe me. Maybe they thought I was just scared of the woods. But I knew what I saw, and I never went camping again. I had been planning the camping trip for weeks. Just a solo weekend in the middle of nowhere, away from the noise, away from people. I needed it. My job had been running me into the ground, and I was tired of the endless routine. I wanted to wake up to silence, the sound of the wind through the trees, the crackle of a fire, nothing else. No stress, no deadlines, just me and nature. I picked a spot deep in the forest, far from any campsites, a place where no one would bother me. It was an old trail, barely used, but it led to a small clearing by a lake. I had found it on an old map online and marked it as my destination. It was supposed to be perfect, secluded, peaceful. The first day was normal. The drive was long, but I liked that. It gave me time to clear my mind. When I finally arrived at the small dirt road that led into the woods, I felt a sense of relief. I parked my truck, grabbed my gear, and started walking. The air was crisp, the forest was quiet, and the deeper I went, the more relaxed I felt. It took me about an hour to reach the clearing. The lake was smaller than I expected, but beautiful. The water was still, reflecting the sky. Trees surrounded the area, their leaves barely rustling. I set up my tent near the water, gathered some firewood, and made a small fire as the sun started setting. I ate, stared into the flames, and for the first time in months, I felt at peace. That peace didn't last long. The first thing that felt off was the silence. The deep woods are never truly silent. There are always birds, insects, the occasional rustling in the bushes. But that first night, it was too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. At first, I told myself it was normal. Maybe the wildlife here was just different. Maybe they settled down early. But the more I sat there, staring into the darkness beyond my fire, the more uncomfortable I felt. The air seemed heavier. I felt watched. I convinced myself I was just being paranoid. It was my first solo trip this deep into the woods, after all. It made sense that my mind was playing tricks on me. I forced myself to ignore it and eventually crawled into my tent, making sure my knife was within reach before falling asleep. A snapping branch woke me up. I sat up instantly, my heart pounding. The fire had burned low, casting faint flickering shadows against the tent walls. I listened. The forest was still dead silent. Then another sound, something moving through the trees, slow, deliberate. Not the random scurrying of an animal, but something heavier. I held my breath. The footsteps stopped. I stayed still for what felt like forever, waiting, listening. Nothing, just the wind. I told myself it had to be a deer, maybe a raccoon, but the feeling in my gut told me otherwise. I didn't sleep well after that. Every little sound had me on edge, but the rest of the night passed without incident. Morning came, and the uneasy feeling still clung to me. I made breakfast, walked around the lake, tried to shake it off. The sun was bright, the trees swayed lazily. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling. That's when I noticed the footprints. At first, I thought they were mine. But the more I looked, the more I realized they weren't. They were bigger, wider, and they weren't fresh. I could see that the edges had softened, like they had been there for a while. But here's the thing. They weren't there the night before. I would have noticed. I had walked this area, checked the ground. Someone had been here. I tried to stay calm, but my hands were shaking. Could have been an old hiker's tracks, I told myself. Maybe someone had been here weeks ago, and I just didn't notice last night. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I decided I'd stay one more night. I wasn't about to let paranoia ruin my trip. I had a rifle in my truck, but I hadn't brought it with me to the campsite. I figured a knife and some bear spray would be enough. Now I regretted that. The second night was worse. I kept my fire bigger, hoping it would keep whatever was out there away. But again, the silence settled in, thick and unnatural. I sat by the fire, listening, waiting. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, closer this time, slow, deliberate. My breath caught in my throat. I grabbed my knife, standing up, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. My fire cast flickering shadows, making it hard to see beyond the trees. I could feel my pulse in my ears. Then something moved at the edge of the trees. Not an animal, person, just standing there. I couldn't make out a face, just the outline of someone standing between the trees, watching, not moving, just there. I didn't call out. I didn't want to know what would happen if I did. Instead, I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed my flashlight, turned it on, and aimed it directly at them. Nothing. No one was there. My stomach twisted. I know what I saw. There was someone there. But now, there was only darkness and trees. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, knife in hand, waiting for the sun. Every so often, I heard movement, branches snapping, leaves rustling, but I never saw anything again. As soon as the sky started turning pale with morning light, I packed my things. I moved fast, not caring about breakfast, not caring about anything except getting back to my truck. The walk back felt longer. Every sound made me jump. The feeling of being watched never left me. When I finally reached my truck, I nearly collapsed with relief. I tossed my gear into the back, jumped in, and locked the doors. Then, as I started the engine, I saw it. A single muddy handprint on the driver's side window. Not mine. I never went camping alone again. It started out as a quiet weekend getaway. I had been feeling worn out, and a few days in a cabin, away from the noise of the city, seemed like the perfect way to recharge. A friend of mine had a small cabin tucked deep in the woods about a 3-hour drive away. It wasn't exactly luxury. It had no Wi-Fi, no TV, just the basics. A wood stove, a couple of bedrooms, and a porch overlooking a dense forest. But that's exactly what I needed. Peace, isolation, and some time alone to think. I arrived late on a Friday afternoon. The drive had been long, and the winding road leading up to the cabin was barely more than a dirt path. The woods were thick with trees, and the sun was already sinking behind the mountains. As I parked in front of the cabin, I couldn't help but notice how quiet everything was. The only sound was the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze and the occasional distant call of a bird. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, like something is just waiting to break it. I grabbed my bags and walked up the creaky porch steps, unlocking the door with the key my friend had given me. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood and something faintly earthy, like pine needles. There was a small kitchen to the left, a living room with a couple of worn couches, and a fireplace on the far wall. The light was dim, but there was something warm about it. I liked the way it felt, isolated but comfortable. The place was as simple as I remembered. I threw my bags onto the couch, unpacked a bit, and made myself a cup of tea. I sat by the window, sipping slowly, watching the trees sway in the twilight. There was something about the woods here that felt different, more alive in a way. I had spent time in the wilderness before, but this place was different. Maybe it was the stillness or the feeling of being so far from anything. It was beautiful in a haunting sort of way. As the sky darkened, I built a fire in the fireplace and settled in. I had no intention of doing much, just relaxing, maybe reading and enjoying the solitude. But as the hours passed and the wind picked up, I started to notice something. The cabin, despite its solitude, didn't feel empty. There was a sense of presence, like someone or something was just outside my line of sight. The kind of sensation you get when you feel eyes on you, even when no one is there. I tried to ignore it. It was just my imagination, I told myself. The crackling fire and the wind outside were enough to fill the silence. But then it happened. A noise, a soft tapping, almost like a finger drumming on wood. But it wasn't coming from inside. Came from the direction of the door. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't remember hearing anyone approach. I hadn't seen a single car on the road leading up to the cabin. I set my tea down, stood up, and cautiously walked over to the door. There was nothing, just the dark outline of the porch and the trees beyond. The wind was picking up now, howling through the branches, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been standing there, just out of view. I double-checked the lock and returned to the fire. My hands were shaking, but I tried to push the unsettling feeling aside. I was alone. There was nothing out there, just the wind. I settled back onto the couch, trying to convince myself to relax. But the longer I sat there, the more the silence felt suffocating. Every crack of the wood, every shift in the breeze felt magnified. My mind kept drifting back to the tapping sound. Had I imagined it, or had someone really been there? The night stretched on, and I eventually went to bed. I kept the curtains closed tightly, and I slept fitfully, waking up several times, disoriented, with the sense that something was wrong. The wind outside had grown stronger, rattling the windows and making the whole cabin creak. The next morning, I woke up early, feeling exhausted. I hadn't slept well, and the strange noises from the night before were still fresh in my mind. I told myself it was just the wind, that the cabin was old, and it had its quirks, but something still felt off. I went out onto the porch to get some fresh air, hoping to clear my head. The sun was up now, casting long shadows over the forest. Everything looked so peaceful, too peaceful. The forest stretched out in every direction, a dense thicket of trees and underbrush. The silence was back, but this time it felt even more oppressive, as if the woods were holding their breath, waiting. I decided to take a walk. Maybe the exercise would help shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. I grabbed a jacket, put on my boots, and headed down a narrow trail that led into the woods. First, it was nice. The sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled light on the ground. I walked for about an hour, lost in the quiet beauty of the place. But then, as I was rounding a bend in the trail, I noticed something strange, something out of place. A set of footprints, fresh ones. They were larger than mine, deeper in the soft earth, and they led off the trail, disappearing into the underbrush. I stopped dead in my tracks. I was certain I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail when I left the cabin. The prints looked recent, maybe from the last few hours. They didn't seem to belong to any animal I recognized. I followed them instinctively, even though my gut was screaming at me to turn back. The trail grew more overgrown as I moved deeper into the woods, and the prints became harder to follow, but I kept going. My breath came in shallow bursts, and my pulse thudded in my ears. Every step felt heavier than the last. The trail eventually led me to a small clearing, and that's when I saw it. A broken-down shack, barely visible through the thick brush. It was made of old wood, its windows shattered, and its roof sagging under the weight of age. I felt my stomach drop. I didn't know why, but the sight of it unsettled me more than anything else I had encountered. There was no reason for a shack to be so far out here, in the middle of nowhere. I stepped closer, carefully, trying not to make any noise. My mind raced with questions. Who built this place? Who would live out here so far from the cabin, in the heart of the woods? I reached the door of the shack and hesitated. Something told me to turn back, but I couldn't. I had to know. I pushed the door open with a creak and stepped inside. The interior was dark, with the faint smell of mold and decay. The floor was covered in dust, and the walls were bare except for a few faded pictures and some old shelves. But what caught my eye were the marks on the floor, scattered, faint, almost like scratches. Took me a moment to realize what I was looking at. They were recent, too recent. Suddenly, the air felt thick, suffocating. My pulse raced, and I quickly turned to leave. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper, like someone was breathing behind me. I spun around, heart in my throat, but there was nothing there. I didn't wait to investigate further. I bolted out of the shack, my breath ragged, and didn't stop running until I reached the cabin. By the time I got back, it was late afternoon. My mind was a blur, spinning with confusion and dread. Had I imagined the whole thing? The shack, the footprints, the whisper? It all felt like a dream or a nightmare. I locked the door and closed all the windows, not daring to go outside again. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, trying to calm myself down. The shadows outside seemed to press against the cabin walls, and the silence was oppressive. It felt like the woods themselves were watching, waiting for something. As the night deepened, I heard it again, the tapping, faint but distinct. It was coming from the direction of the door. I grabbed the fireplace poker and stood by the door, my breath shallow, waiting. The noise grew louder, more persistent. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. And then I realized the footprints, the shack, the strange sounds, they weren't random. They were all connected. Something or someone had been out there and they were watching me. But I wasn't alone anymore. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like there was something protecting me. Something that had been with me all along. The presence that had been lingering in the cabin wasn't a threat. It was a warning. The tapping started again, but this time it was different. It wasn't outside anymore. It was inside. I turned toward the sound, and for the first time I understood. The cabin wasn't empty, and it wasn't mine to keep. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, just a simple getaway to escape the noise of the city. I needed time to breathe, clear my head, and maybe even get some writing done. So when I found this cabin in the middle of nowhere, tucked away in the woods, I thought it was perfect. The listing said it was rustic but cozy, surrounded by trees with only a small creek running nearby. Nothing else for miles. I'd be alone. Just me, nature, and peace. I should have known from the start that it was too good to be true. The drive to the cabin took longer than expected. I had to navigate narrow, winding roads, and by the time I arrived, it was already getting dark. The sun had dipped behind the trees, and a heavy fog had started rolling in. The temperature dropped too. It felt colder than it had any right to, considering it was supposed to be an early autumn evening. I parked the car in front of the cabin and looked around. It looked exactly like the pictures. Log walls, a small porch with an old rocking chair, and a big fireplace chimney puffing out a thin column of smoke. It was quaint, yes, but there was something unsettling about the stillness in the air. No sounds of animals, no rustling of leaves, just dead silence. The kind of silence that makes you feel like you're being watched. I shrugged it off. I'm just imagining things. It's probably the isolation getting to me, The keys were waiting for me inside the little lockbox on the porch. It was a cheap little combination lock, the kind you'd expect to find at a low-cost motel. I slid the keys out, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The cabin smelled like wood, old wood, damp and musty, but still pleasant in its own way. The interior was as rustic as the outside, with mismatched furniture and a stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. A few oil lamps sat on the mantel, their wicks still unlit. It felt like no one had lived here for quite a while. I set my bag down and immediately made my way to the kitchen. The floor creaked under my feet as I walked. It wasn't as bad as I had imagined it might be. The kitchen was functional enough, even if it was a little outdated. There was a stove, a refrigerator that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in a while, and an old wooden table. But all the essentials were here, so I started making myself comfortable. As the night wore on, the weather worsened outside. The fog grew thicker, and a soft rain began to tap against the roof, adding to the isolation I felt. I lit a few of the oil lamps and sat down with a book, hoping to unwind. There was no phone service out here, no internet, and I figured that would be good for me. I hadn't had a proper break in a while, and this was the kind of escape I needed. But that peace didn't last long. Around midnight, as I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, I heard something. A knock, faint but distinct, coming from the door. I froze. At first, I thought I might have imagined it. Maybe it was the wind, or a branch brushing against the house. But no, there it was again. A soft, deliberate knock, 3 quick raps in succession. My heart rate quickened. I hadn't seen another car on the road when I arrived. No one had passed by all day. It was just me here. The idea of someone being out there, knocking at this hour, sent a cold shiver down my spine. I slid out of bed and crept toward the door. The cabin was small, and the layout meant I could hear any sound clearly. My mind raced. Who would be out here at this time of night? There were no other houses around. Maybe it was just a hiker who'd gotten lost in the fog. But even then, why didn't they come to the window or call out instead? I slowly approached the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. The knock came again. Quick, sharp, 3 raps, followed by silence. I froze, just standing there, too scared to open the door, too scared to even breathe. But then, a voice. A soft, muffled voice. So quiet I could barely hear it. It sounded like a whisper, but clear enough for me to catch the words. Please help me. The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. My mind spun, and I could feel the sweat forming on the back of my neck. I didn't open the door. Couldn't. I backed away from it, my eyes scanning the cabin, looking for any kind of weapon, any sign that I could defend myself if I needed to. I waited. Nothing. After a few minutes, I cautiously moved back to the door. I cracked it open a bit, but no one was there. The fog had thickened, and the rain was now coming down in sheets. The porch light barely lit up the yard, and I couldn't see beyond a few feet in front of me. There was no sign of anyone, but I could still feel the hairs on my neck standing up. I closed the door quickly and locked it. What was going on? Was I just imagining things? But it felt too real, too vivid. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The rest of the night passed in restless, paranoid silence. I didn't sleep, couldn't. Every little noise made me jump. Footsteps on the porch, the wind, the creaking of the old wood. My eyes darted around the room, checking every shadow, every corner. The morning light was a relief. Felt like I'd barely survived the night. I made myself some coffee and tried to ignore the unease that still gripped me. Maybe I was just being dramatic. I thought, maybe the isolation and the storm had messed with my mind. I decided to go for a walk to clear my head. The woods around the cabin were dense, the trees towering above me, their branches reaching out like twisted fingers. I walked along a narrow trail that seemed to go on forever, unsure of where it led. The fog had lifted, but the air still felt damp, the ground soft beneath my boots. I wanted to be sure I wasn't losing my mind, so I kept walking, trying to shake the feeling of being followed. Eventually, I came to a clearing. In the middle of it, I found something odd. A small structure, almost hidden by the thick trees around it. It wasn't a house or anything, but some kind of shack. It was old, falling apart, its wooden walls weathered and decayed by time. Something about it felt wrong. The kind of wrong that makes you want to run the other way. But I couldn't stop myself. I had to take a closer look. I approached the shack carefully, my eyes scanning the surroundings. There were no signs of anyone being there recently.
No footprints.
No fresh signs of life. But as I got closer, I noticed something strange. A faint smell in the air. A sickly, rotting scent that made my stomach turn. I stepped inside, my boots crunching on the dry leaves and broken wood. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. The walls were covered in old, peeling wallpaper, and there was a rusted stove in one corner, covered in grime. The place had been abandoned for years, or so I thought. Then I saw it. A small, leather-bound book, half buried under some broken furniture. I picked it up, careful not to disturb anything else. When I opened it, I felt my stomach drop. The pages were filled with strange, scrawled writing, scribbles, symbols, and half-finished sentences. Some of the writing was almost unreadable, but there was one page that caught my eye. It was a drawing, no, not a drawing, a map that showed the very cabin I was staying in, with a series of marks and strange notations drawn on it. And in the bottom corner, scrawled in red ink, were the words, "You are not alone." I froze. I could feel my heart racing in my chest. My fingers trembled as I turned the page. There, at the back, were more words. A warning: don't trust the trees. They watch. Suddenly, the air felt thick. I dropped the book, backing away from the shack. My mind raced. What the hell was going on? This wasn't just a harmless getaway. This wasn't just some random stormy night. There was something deeply wrong with this place. I sprinted back to the cabin, not stopping until I was safely inside. My hands were shaking as I locked the door behind me. I couldn't stay here another night. I had to leave, but when I tried to start the car, it wouldn't start. I could feel the panic rising in my chest as I turned the key over and over, but the engine wouldn't even sputter. The battery had died. It took me a while to realize the truth. I wasn't just stuck here by chance. Someone had been watching me from the very beginning, from the moment I arrived. There was no way I could have known it, but I was never meant to leave. It was then that I noticed it, the faint sound of footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate steps. The same soft, muffled footsteps I had heard the night before. And this time, they weren't stopping. I'd always heard the cabin in the woods was a place for people who wanted to escape everything. A place to clear your mind, get away from the noise of the city, the rush, and the constant pressure. I didn't think much about that when I decided to go. After all, I was looking for some time alone to reset. The thought of being in complete silence, surrounded by nature, sounded like the perfect retreat. The cabin was far out. It wasn't on any map, at least not the ones I had. A long, unmarked road twisted up the mountainside, through thick trees, and around sharp bends that felt like they would send me off the edge of the world. I had rented the place online, and the listing said it would take a few hours to get there. I remember thinking that sounded like a bit much, but I wasn't going to turn back. I arrived just as the sky was dimming. The cabin was an old, weathered building, tucked away behind a large patch of trees. It looked exactly like the kind of place you'd imagine in a horror movie, but there was something oddly comforting about it. The walls were covered in dark, peeling wood that seemed to match the deep colors of the surrounding forest. There were no other houses around for miles, just towering trees, their limbs swaying in the wind. Inside, the place smelled of dust and pine. A large stone fireplace dominated the living room, and the furniture, while old, was surprisingly well kept. I immediately felt the weight of isolation. There was no cell service, no Wi-Fi, not even a landline. It was just me, the cabin, and the wilderness. That night, I sat up by the fire with a book I had been meaning to finish. The crackling flames filled the silence, and the air was crisp but not uncomfortable. Every now and then, I'd hear the distant sound of a twig snapping outside or a branch brushing against the side of the cabin. I thought nothing of it. It was just the forest, the wind, the animals, the sounds that came with being alone in the middle of nowhere. But as the night wore on, I noticed something strange. Every time I thought I heard a noise from outside, I'd go to the window to look, but there would be nothing. No movement, no signs of life. Just the still, dark woods stretching out into the unknown. The following morning, I woke up early, the air outside already cool and fresh. I stepped out onto the porch, stretching my legs and taking in the view. The woods seemed even quieter than the night before, a stillness that settled deep in my chest. I was still the only person around as far as I could tell. The nearest town was miles away, and there was no sign of anyone else anywhere nearby. But as I looked around the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I shrugged it off as nerves. I was just here to relax, after all. So, I took a walk down the narrow dirt path that led from the cabin. The sun was still low in the sky, and the forest was a deep shade of green, the shadows of the trees stretching long across the ground. Birds chirped in the distance, and the wind rustled the leaves above me. But there was something else, a low, almost imperceptible sound that I couldn't place. It wasn't the usual forest noises. It was more like a soft shuffle, like someone or something was moving just beyond the trees. I stopped and listened, but the sound stopped too. I shook my head, telling myself I was imagining things. Maybe it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear. I had heard of them in these woods, but there was no denying the unease creeping into my mind. By the time the afternoon came, the unsettling feeling hadn't gone away. In fact, it only seemed to grow stronger. When I went back to the cabin, I double-checked the locks on all the windows and doors, even though I didn't think anyone would be around for miles. But something felt wrong. There was no sign of life out there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That evening, I heard the sound again. It started as a faint rustling, like branches moving in the wind, but it was different, too deliberate. Then, a low thud, like something heavy dropping. My heart started racing, and I immediately grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and went to the door. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, but there was nothing. No footprints, no movement. I stepped outside, trying to calm myself down, telling myself it was just my nerves playing tricks on me. I walked around the cabin, scanning the area, but the forest was still and silent. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every shift of the floorboards, made my skin crawl. I lay in bed, wide awake, listening. The wind had picked up, and the trees groaned outside, but there was something else, something I couldn't quite place. The next morning, I didn't feel any better. If anything, the dread had grown. I spent most of the day inside, avoiding the outside world, but as the sun began to set, I decided to go back out for a walk. I told myself I had to face whatever this was, to prove I wasn't scared. As I walked down the path again, something caught my eye, a small, weathered object half buried in the dirt by the side of the trail. I bent down to look closer. It was a broken piece of wood, but what made it strange was the carving. It looked like a symbol, a twisted, angular shape, like a crude representation of an eye. I froze. The feeling that had been gnawing at me for days now surged. I stood up quickly, glancing around. The forest was eerily quiet. There was no breeze, no animals, just silence. I walked faster, the uneasy feeling now overtaking my thoughts. My breath came quicker, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. As I turned to head back to the cabin, I heard the shuffling sound again, this time closer, much closer. I broke into a run. I don't know how long I ran, or what pushed me to move so fast, but by the time I reached the cabin, I was breathless and panicked. My heart pounded in my chest. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it, rushing to the windows and pulling the curtains tight. I wasn't going out again. The rest of the night was a blur. I spent hours pacing, checking the locks, peering out the windows, but there was nothing. No sign of anyone. The darkness outside seemed to swallow the cabin whole. The next morning, I packed my things. I wasn't going to stay another night. The woods felt too oppressive, too suffocating. The odd symbol, the sounds, the constant feeling of being watched, they had gotten to me. I couldn't shake the terror that had set in. As I started to drive away, I glanced back at the cabin in my rearview mirror. It sat there, still and empty, but for some reason, I couldn't help but feel like I had left something behind. Something that was waiting, watching, hidden in the shadows. It was meant to be a break, a weekend retreat. Just me, the forest, and the silence. I'd been working nonstop for months, always glued to my desk in that same cramped office. Every weekend was filled with errands, chores, and endless social obligations. It felt like I'd forgotten how to be alone, how to enjoy the stillness of being in the middle of nowhere. The cabin in the woods was my escape, or at least it was supposed to be. I arrived at the cabin just as the sun was setting. The drive had taken longer than I expected, the winding road a little harder to navigate in the dim light. But I'd finally made it. The cabin sat just off a gravel path, hidden from view by dense trees on all sides. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small, one-story building with a rusted tin roof and a front porch that looked like it hadn't been used in years. But it was perfect for what I needed. Peace, quiet, and time to think. The air felt different here, cleaner somehow. The smell of pine filled my nose as I dragged my suitcase from the car to the porch. The place was completely isolated, no neighbors for miles, and that was exactly what I was looking for.
No distractions, no noise.
Just me and the woods. Inside, the cabin was basic but cozy. Wooden floors creaked under my feet as I stepped through the door. The walls were lined with old furniture, a worn-out couch, a rickety coffee table, a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The kitchen was small, but it had everything I needed. I wasn't planning to spend much time inside anyway. I wanted to explore, get some fresh air, and clear my head. I spent the first hour unpacking, settling in, and then I grabbed my jacket and went outside. The sun had dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the forest. I walked along a narrow trail that seemed to lead into the woods, the ground soft with fallen leaves. The trees here were tall, their trunks thick and twisted, the branches high above creating a canopy that blocked out most of the light. It felt peaceful, almost dreamlike. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a bird in the distance. I walked for what felt like hours, enjoying the solitude. It was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that made you aware of every tiny sound. The crunch of a twig beneath my boots, the whisper of wind through the branches. But I didn't mind. I needed this. The longer I walked, the more I felt my stress melt away. When I finally turned around to head back to the cabin, it was almost completely dark. The sun had long since vanished, and the moon was barely a sliver in the sky. The trail I had followed was harder to make out now, the shadows of the trees creating an almost suffocating darkness. I knew I had wandered farther than I intended, but I wasn't worried. I'd seen enough of the area to know I could find my way back easily, or so I thought. I walked for what felt like hours, retracing my steps, but the familiar landmarks, the large rock by the trail, the fallen tree were nowhere to be found. The darkness was getting thicker, and the sounds of the forest seemed to be closing in on me. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees in an eerie way, and I could hear things moving in the underbrush, though I couldn't see what it was. Panic started to set in. I'd gotten lost. It was as simple as that. I tried to stay calm, focusing on breathing, but the more I tried to rationalize the situation, the more my mind started to race. The trees felt closer now, like they were watching me. The wind seemed to carry a sense of urgency, and I could almost feel something or someone following me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I pulled out my phone to check the time, but there was no signal. The screen just displayed no service. Great, that was just perfect. I'd already wandered too far to turn back now, and with no way to contact anyone, I was on my own. I kept walking, telling myself that the cabin was just around the corner, but the more I moved, the less sure I was. The forest seemed to stretch on endlessly, and every turn felt the same. The trees were like a maze, and I was trapped in the middle of it. I stumbled over a root, nearly twisting my ankle, and that was when I heard it, a low, distant sound. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but it grew louder, closer. It was the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the underbrush. I stopped in my tracks, holding my breath. My heart was pounding in my chest. The footsteps continued, growing louder with each passing second. Someone or something was out there. I strained my ears, trying to listen for more details. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic. It was human, or at least it sounded human. I backed up slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. My mind was racing. Was it another hiker? No, I would have heard their voice or seen their flashlight by now. The air felt charged with something that wasn't right. A feeling of dread was settling in my stomach, and I couldn't shake it. My eyes darted from tree to tree, looking for any sign of movement, but the darkness was overwhelming. Then, without warning, the footsteps stopped. Complete silence followed, as if whatever it was had just vanished. I stood frozen, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Every muscle in my body was tense, and I felt an overwhelming urge to run. But where would I run to? The cabin was too far away. I don't know how long I stood there, waiting for the sound to return, but eventually, I forced myself to move. I took a few slow steps forward, each one feeling heavier than the last. The air was thick with tension, and I kept expecting to hear the footsteps again, but they never came. It was as if whatever had been there was just waiting, watching. The feeling of being hunted wouldn't leave. After what felt like hours, I finally saw a faint glow in the distance. The cabin. I found it. Relief washed over me, and I pushed myself to walk faster, my legs burning from exhaustion. I reached the porch just as the first drops of rain started to fall. I was safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there with me, something that had been following me through the woods. The cabin was silent, but the air inside felt oppressive, as if the walls were closing in on me. I locked the door behind me, drew the curtains, and sat on the couch, trying to steady my breathing. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, made me jump. But eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, the rain had stopped. The sky was gray, and the air felt thick with moisture. I didn't want to leave the cabin, but I knew I had to. I needed to get out of that forest. I grabbed my things, packed up, and left. As I was driving away, I couldn't help but glance at the trees, the woods that had felt so peaceful at first. There was nothing there, nothing visible, but I knew something was out there, something that had been watching me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that, even though I was leaving, it wasn't over. The drive back was long, but it gave me time to think. Maybe I'd just been paranoid, I thought. Maybe I had let my fear get the best of me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just my imagination. Whatever had been in those woods was real, and I would never forget it. I always thought the idea of spending a weekend alone in a cabin would be peaceful, maybe even a little refreshing. My friend Mark had been trying to get me to do it for months. "You need a break," he'd said. "Get out into nature. Clear your head." I didn't really need a reason. I was worn out from the constant noise of city life, the grind, the people, the deadlines. A weekend alone sounded perfect. So, I packed my bags and drove out to the cabin Mark had rented. It was way out in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. It didn't even have Wi-Fi. The place was small, just a little two-room cabin, with a wood stove and a big stone fireplace that looked like something out of a movie. The air smelled fresh, like pine trees and earth. I figured I'd spend my time reading, maybe cooking some simple meals and just getting some rest. The drive had taken a few hours, but it wasn't too bad. The sun was setting as I arrived, casting long shadows over the trees. I grabbed my things from the trunk and headed up the short path to the cabin. It had an old wooden sign that read "Whispering Pines." Sounded cheesy, but I didn't mind. Inside, the cabin had that rustic charm that people seem to love. The furniture was worn, the floor creaked underfoot, and everything smelled like cedar. It was cozy. There was a large armchair by the fire, a little kitchen with a small table, and a loft above that could be reached by a wooden ladder. I couldn't see the upstairs too clearly in the dim light, but it didn't matter. I wasn't going to be here long enough to explore. After lighting the stove and unpacking, I sat in front of the fire. The flames crackled, and I settled into the chair with a book I'd brought. The night was quiet, too quiet in a way. The occasional sound of a branch snapping in the wind or the distant hoot of an owl was about all I heard. That was when I first noticed it. A low scraping sound. It was faint, but it cut through the silence like a knife. Came from outside, maybe from the woods behind the cabin. I froze, trying to focus. It sounded like something dragging along the ground, slow and deliberate. I thought it was just the wind or maybe an animal, but there was something unnerving about it. After a few minutes, the noise stopped. I shrugged it off. I'd heard sounds like that in the woods before. Animals, especially at night, could make strange noises. I was just being paranoid. I went back to reading, but the unease lingered in the back of my mind. The wind picked up outside, whistling through the trees, and the temperature seemed to drop a little. I was getting tired, so I decided to head up to bed. The ladder to the loft was steep, but it wasn't too bad. The upstairs was small, with a bed and a few old boxes. The bed had a thick quilt on it, and I sunk into it, pulling the blankets around me. I couldn't sleep at first. I kept hearing the wind, the trees rattling against each other, but there was also something else, something faint, like footsteps. I sat up, listening, but the sounds faded away. Could have been my imagination. I was just tired. I closed my eyes, trying to shut it all out. Eventually, I drifted off into a light sleep, but it wasn't peaceful. In the middle of the night, I woke up with a start, heart racing. I couldn't explain why at first. My mind was foggy from sleep, but something felt wrong. There was a pressure in the air, a heaviness. My body was frozen, as if I could sense something that wasn't right. Then the scraping sound came again. This time it was louder, closer. I sat up quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. It was coming from below, just outside the cabin. Something was definitely dragging along the ground. I grabbed my phone off the nightstand, but there was no signal. The cabin was in a dead zone. I waited, listening. The noise stopped, and then As if in response, a loud thud echoed from below. It sounded like something heavy had hit the cabin's wall. I wanted to call for help, but I couldn't even hear my own voice. I stayed still, my breath shallow, trying to hear anything else. There was nothing. No more scraping, no more thudding. Just silence. I stayed up for hours, not daring to move. The fear gnawed at me. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of the wind outside made my skin crawl. Eventually, I heard the sound of footsteps on the wooden floor below. Slow, methodical steps. My pulse raced. Who else was out there? Mark had told me there was no one else nearby for miles. I didn't want to go down there. I didn't want to move at all, but I knew I couldn't stay in the loft forever. My mind raced through every possibility. It had to be an animal, right? But the sound of footsteps was unmistakable. Couldn't be a bear or anything like that. It was too deliberate. I decided to peek down the ladder. Holding my breath, I slid my head over the edge and looked down into the cabin. The fire had died down, leaving only a faint glow from the embers. In the dim light, I could make out shapes. Furniture, the window, the door. But there was no one there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I grabbed my flashlight, and before I could think better of it, I was already halfway down the ladder. The air was cold, and the house felt empty, but there was something oppressive about it, like the walls were closing in. I stood at the bottom of the ladder, scanning the room. The door was locked. The windows were intact. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I moved across the room to the kitchen, but there was no sign of anything unusual. I exhaled, trying to calm myself down. Maybe it was just my nerves playing tricks on me. But then, as I turned to head back toward the ladder, I saw it. The window. The blinds were pulled halfway up. I was certain I hadn't touched them. The flashlight beam shook in my hand as I approached. Slowly, cautiously, I moved toward it. I could see movement through the cracks in the blinds. Something out there, just beyond my reach. I froze. My heart dropped. A figure stood outside, half hidden by the darkness. I couldn't make out details, but I could tell it was tall, and its shape was unnaturally still. I backed away from the window, my chest tightening. Then it moved, quickly, like something unnatural. I bolted toward the door, heart in my throat. I couldn't even think. I didn't know what I was running from, but I had to get out of there. The door wouldn't open. I yanked on the handle, panic flooding my brain. It was stuck. I hit it with my shoulder, but it wouldn't budge. I turned to look at the window again, my breath shallow, and I saw the figure in the reflection of the glass. It was closer now, almost right against the wall. A sudden crash. The door splintered open. Without thinking, I ran. I ran out the door, down the path, not stopping to look back. My mind was racing, my legs burning from the effort, but I couldn't stop. I had to get away. I don't know how long I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, where I collapsed, gasping for air. I pulled out my phone, finally managing to get a weak signal. I called Mark, my hands shaking. He didn't answer. I didn't go back to the cabin. I stayed in the car, parked on the side of the road, and waited until morning. When the sun finally rose, I called for help. A couple of local deputies came to check out the cabin. When they arrived, they told me no one had been there. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of anyone breaking in. They searched the area, found nothing. I left that day, driving straight back home, and I never went back to that cabin. To this day, I don't know what I saw or heard that night. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me in the isolation. But I can't shake the feeling that something was there with me, something that didn't want me to leave. And I'll never forget the way it moved.
So fast.
So unnatural. I haven't stepped foot in the woods since. I had always wanted a break, a weekend getaway from the noise, the constant buzz of phones, and the stress of work. When I found that old cabin for rent deep in the woods, it felt like a perfect escape. The listing claimed it was secluded, surrounded by nothing but trees and nature, far from any busy roads or distractions. It was exactly what I was looking for. I was tired of the city, the people, the constant rush. I needed solitude, silence, and the kind of peace only a remote place could offer. I loaded up my car with supplies, enough food for the weekend, a few books, a sleeping bag, and my guitar, and started the drive. The further I drove, the more I felt myself unwind, the tension in my shoulders easing with each mile. The roads got narrower, the trees thicker, and the houses fewer and farther apart. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the dirt road. The cabin itself looked exactly as the pictures had shown, old but sturdy. A wooden structure, weathered by years of exposure to the elements. The windows were small, with thick curtains drawn over them, and the porch was covered with a layer of dry leaves. It was isolated just like I wanted. No neighbors for miles, just the sound of wind rustling the trees and the occasional bird call. I parked my car, grabbed my things, and walked up to the front door. There was no key under the mat or in the usual hiding spots, so I fumbled with the lock for a moment before the door creaked open. Inside, the air smelled musty, like old wood and dust. The floors were covered with faded rugs, and the furniture, though simple, had a kind of rustic charm. A stone fireplace stood at the far end of the living room, the hearth dark and cold. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was, the kind of silence you only get when you're far away from civilization. I loved it. I dropped my bags and took a deep breath, letting the stillness fill me. As I explored the cabin, I realized it was small, just one room with a loft upstairs. There was a kitchen area in the corner, a small table with a couple of chairs, and a narrow staircase leading up to the loft. The loft had a single bed, a small dresser, and a tiny window that looked out over the woods. The view was incredible, just miles of trees stretching as far as I could see. I decided to settle in. I put my things in the loft, grabbed my guitar, and made myself some dinner. As the evening wore on, I sat by the fire, playing a few tunes and watching the flames dance. The crackling of the fire, the sound of the wind outside. It was peaceful. But as the night went on, I started to notice something strange. The quiet was almost too quiet. There were no animals in the distance, no sounds of insects buzzing or owls hooting. It was as if the entire forest had gone still. I didn't think much of it at first, but as the hours dragged on, the silence started to feel heavier, almost oppressive. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the remoteness of the place, that it was normal for it to be this still. But the more I sat there, the more uneasy I became. I went to bed around midnight, curling up in the loft under a thick quilt. The bed was comfortable enough, and the air had cooled, making it perfect for sleeping. But sleep didn't come. I kept hearing things, soft thuds from downstairs, like footsteps. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but then I heard a scraping sound. I froze. The sound came again, followed by a low thump. I strained to listen, my heart pounding in my chest. The noise seemed to be coming from just outside the cabin. I couldn't see anything through the small window, and the curtains were drawn tight, but I swore I saw a shadow pass across the edge of the glass. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. Maybe it was an animal, a raccoon, or something larger. The wind was picking up, and I thought perhaps the branches of the trees were brushing against the side of the cabin. But then I heard it again, soft, deliberate footsteps, pacing back and forth just outside. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight from the bedside table and slowly made my way down the stairs. I didn't want to open the door, but I had to see what was out there. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I tiptoed to the front door. I held my breath, listening for any more sounds. The footsteps had stopped, but now there was a new sound, something scraping against the wood of the cabin. It was faint, but it was there. I twisted the doorknob and slowly pushed the door open just a crack, shining the flashlight outside. The beam of light cut through the dark, illuminating the porch and the surrounding woods. There was nothing there. I breathed a sigh of relief, but as I stepped back inside, I heard the noise again, this time louder and closer. It was coming from the back of the cabin. My pulse quickened. What the hell was going on? I didn't want to go outside, but I also didn't want to just sit here and wait. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that something was out there, watching the cabin. I grabbed the iron poker from beside the fireplace and cautiously made my way to the back door. When I opened it, the wind hit me hard. The forest stretched out in front of me, empty and still. The flashlight beam shook slightly in my hand as I scanned the area, but there was nothing to see. I stepped outside, every muscle in my body tensed. My boots crunched on the gravel as I walked around the cabin, checking the corners and looking for anything out of place. The night air was cold, and the trees loomed over me like silent sentinels. I felt exposed out here, vulnerable. Suddenly, I heard it, a sharp, jagged sound from somewhere nearby, something scratching at the trees, dragging along the bark. I whipped around, shining the light in all directions, but again, I saw nothing. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a cold sweat on the back of my neck. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew it wasn't normal. I rushed back inside, slamming the door behind me. The house felt safer, but even then, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I locked the door, bolted the windows, and sat in the dark, waiting for morning. But sleep didn't come. The sounds continued throughout the night, faint and eerie, scraping and tapping against the walls of the cabin. It was as though something was trying to get in. I didn't know what it was, but I felt it. When the first light of dawn finally crept through the cracks in the curtains, I felt a strange sense of relief. The sounds had stopped, and the world outside looked calm again. The woods were quiet, but not oppressively so. It was as if whatever had been out there had disappeared. I spent the rest of the day in a haze, trying to shake off the lingering feeling of dread. The cabin, once a retreat, now felt like a trap. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't bring myself to drive back. The roads were treacherous, and the thought of being stuck out there in the dark again made my skin crawl. That evening, as the sun began to set, I decided to make my escape. I packed up quickly, not bothering to check the cabin for anything I might have left behind. I just wanted to get out. As I drove down the dirt road, I kept my eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me. But there was nothing. The woods were silent again, the trees dark and still in the fading light. I finally reached the highway, and with a sense of relief, I drove toward the nearest town. I wasn't sure what had happened that weekend, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going back. The cabin, the isolation, the strange sounds. It had all been too much. I never learned what was out there in the woods, but I didn't need to. Sometimes it's best to leave certain things in the dark. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway, just me and the quiet of the mountains. I had rented the cabin months in advance, looking for a break from the city, something simple and disconnected. No distractions, no work emails, no people. Just a few days of nothing but the sound of birds and the wind in the trees. The cabin stood on the edge of a dense forest, deep in the Appalachian Mountains. I drove for hours to get there, my car winding through narrow, overgrown roads. The further I went, the fewer signs of civilization there were. I barely passed another vehicle. There was something unsettling about the isolation, but I shrugged it off. I'd always liked being alone. When I finally arrived, it was late afternoon. The sky was a dull gray, clouds rolling in from the horizon. The cabin was exactly as it had looked in the photos. Rustic, weathered wood with a porch that creaked when I stepped on it. It looked old, but sturdy, and I liked that. I carried my bags inside, the door creaking in protest as I opened it. The interior was cozy, exactly what I needed. A large stone fireplace, wooden beams overhead, a leather couch, and a small kitchen tucked into the corner. There was no electricity, just gas lamps that I flicked on one by one, bathing the room in a soft, yellow glow. Felt warm, safe, like the world outside couldn't reach me here. I unpacked my things, made myself a simple dinner, and sat by the fire with a book. The first night was quiet. Too quiet, really, but I didn't mind. After all, that's what I had come for. The silence was a blessing. But the next day, things started to feel off. I woke up early, as I always do, the faint light from outside creeping through the curtains. The air felt colder than usual, but I assumed it was just the mountain weather. I made coffee and went outside to sit on the porch, the wooden floor cool under my feet. The trees stretched up into the sky, their leaves rustling softly in the wind. It was peaceful, just like I had imagined. I didn't think much of it at first, but as the day went on, I began to notice things that didn't sit right. Small things, but enough to make my stomach turn. The wind seemed to carry a strange hum, like a low whistle through the branches. The birds were quiet, but there were other sounds, things that didn't belong. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid. After all, the woods were full of wildlife. But the more I listened, the more I felt like I was being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, felt like it was aimed directly at me. By mid-afternoon, I decided to take a hike. I had mapped out a trail that was supposed to lead to a small lake a few miles away. The fresh air and the sound of my boots crunching on the dirt trail would clear my head. I grabbed a backpack, threw in a bottle of water, and headed out. The trail wound through the trees, the thick underbrush brushing against my legs. As I walked, the unsettling feeling from earlier started to fade. The trail was well-marked, easy to follow, and for a while, I let myself relax. The further I went, the deeper into the forest I seemed to get, but I wasn't worried. I had a map, and I knew I wasn't far from the cabin. But then I reached a point where the trail seemed to disappear. It wasn't anything drastic, just a small bend in the path where the trees grew thick and the ground turned marshy. There was no sign of the trail marker anymore, no direction to go. I hesitated, staring at the mess of underbrush and tangled branches ahead. I tried retracing my steps, but the forest around me felt unfamiliar. Had I missed something? The feeling of being watched returned, sharper now, like there was something out there in the woods just beyond my sight. I quickened my pace, hoping to find the trail again. And then I saw it, a small, dilapidated structure in the distance. It was barely visible through the trees, just a hint of a roof poking out. At first, I thought it might be some kind of old shack or hunting lodge long abandoned. Curiosity got the better of me, and I started toward it. As I got closer, the building became clearer. It was in worse shape than I had imagined, its walls sagging, windows boarded up. The door hung crookedly on its hinges, as if it hadn't been touched in years. There was a strange smell in the air, a mixture of decay and something sour, but I couldn't place it. I stepped up to the door, the wood creaking under my weight. My hand hovered over the knob, a strange urge pulling me forward. I don't know why I decided to open it, but I did. Inside was a room, dark and musty, with broken furniture scattered about. A layer of dust covered everything. A small table sat against the far wall, next to a fireplace. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of mildew. There was nothing of interest, just the remnants of whatever had once been here. But then, on the table, I saw something. A small, leather-bound book. I don't know why, but I picked it up, The pages were yellowed and fragile. The ink faded with age. As I flipped through it, I saw odd scribblings, sketches of strange symbols, descriptions of the land around the cabin, and references to things I couldn't understand. The writing grew more erratic toward the end of the book, the words almost nonsensical. It was as if someone had been losing their mind, recording everything they saw in the woods. I felt a chill run down my spine, and for the first time, I realized that maybe I wasn't alone. I set the book down quickly, stepped back from the table, and turned to leave. But when I reached the door, I froze. There was something on the other side, a sound. It wasn't a person, no, it was something far worse. It was a deep, guttural growl, like an animal that had been pushed to the edge. My heart raced, and I slowly backed away, my breath shallow. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I had to get out of there. I ran. My feet slipped on the wet ground, the branches whipping at my face as I dashed through the forest, the growl echoing behind me. It was chasing me. Whatever it was hunting me. I didn't stop running until I saw the familiar shape of the cabin through the trees. My legs burned, and my lungs screamed for air, but I pushed forward. I reached the porch and slammed the door shut behind me, locking it with shaking hands. For the rest of the night, I sat in front of the fireplace, heart pounding, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it. The growling, the book, the strange feeling of being watched. But the longer I sat there, the more it felt real. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat, waiting for morning, for the light of day to bring some sense of safety. But when dawn finally came, the sun weak and distant, something was different. The air was still thick with unease, and the forest outside seemed quieter. The birds were still gone, and the wind was strangely still. I packed my things as quickly as I could, not caring about the mess. I was done. I wasn't going to stay another night in that cabin. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin, the woods, they were all behind me now. But something about the way the trees seemed to watch me, the way the cabin stood in the distance, I knew I would never forget it. The mountains, I realized, were full of secrets. Some were better left untouched. I've never been the type to be afraid of the dark, but something about the woods that night felt different. It was like the trees had a life of their own, creaking and shifting in a way that was too intentional. It was a feeling I couldn't shake. The woods were quiet, unnaturally quiet, and the silence felt as though it was holding its breath, waiting for something. I arrived at the cabin just as the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the overgrown path that led to it. I had rented the place for the weekend, just a little break from the chaos of the city. I had no intention of doing anything other than unwind. It was supposed to be peaceful. The cabin was secluded, tucked away deep in a forest far from the nearest town. The road was bumpy and barely passable, but I didn't mind. There was something calming about being away from everything, surrounded by nothing but trees. The cabin itself wasn't much to look at, just a small, weathered building with wooden walls and a slanted roof. The paint had long since peeled away, and the place looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. Still, the owner assured me it would be fine. I parked the car and grabbed my bags, feeling the weight of the silence around me as I walked up to the front door. The air was still, the smell of damp earth and pine filling my nostrils. I hesitated for a moment, standing on the creaky porch before unlocking the door and stepping inside. The inside was exactly what I expected. It was simple, almost bare. The floors were creaky, and the furniture was old but serviceable. A couch sat in front of a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area to the side. It looked like a place where someone could come to get away from the world for a little while. I'd brought some food with me, just enough for the weekend, and there was a small wood stove in the corner for warmth. I unpacked my things and made myself comfortable, starting a small fire in the fireplace. The warmth spread through the room quickly, and I sank into the couch, staring into the flames. I hadn't planned on doing much. Just a bit of reading, maybe some writing. The peace and quiet were exactly what I needed. But as the night settled in, something changed. It was subtle at first, a feeling that crept over me, like I wasn't alone. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I felt eyes on me, as though the walls themselves were watching. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a chill despite the fire crackling in the hearth. I told myself it was nothing. The woods can play tricks on your mind, especially at night. Maybe I was just imagining things. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one there. I decided to go to bed early, hoping sleep would bring some relief from the unease that had settled in my chest. I turned off the lights and crawled into the bed, pulling the blankets up to my chin. The room was dark, but I could hear the wind howling outside, the occasional rustle of branches against the cabin's wooden walls. Sleep didn't come easily. I tossed and turned, the sensation of being watched never leaving me. It was like something was lurking just beyond the edge of my consciousness, waiting for me to fall asleep so it could make its move. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke with a start. The air felt heavier now, as though the room had become suffocating. I lay still, listening. There was no sound, no wind, no rustling of branches. Just silence. Deep, unnerving silence. I glanced at the clock on the bedside table. It was well past midnight. That's when I heard it, the faintest sound, coming from somewhere outside the cabin. A soft scraping like nails dragging across wood. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. The sound stopped, and for a moment, there was only the sound of my own breathing. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just an animal or the wind playing tricks again. But then it came again, louder this time, scraping, and then a soft thud, like something heavy being dropped onto the porch. My blood ran cold. I forced myself to move, to sit up, but my body felt like it was made of lead. I didn't want to get up, didn't want to go check what was out there, but I knew I couldn't stay in that bed, not with the sounds getting closer. Slowly, I slid out from under the covers, my feet touching the cold wooden floor. My heart was pounding in my ears as I crept toward the window, peering through the dusty curtains. The moonlight bathed the forest in an eerie glow, casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. There was nothing out there, just trees. The stillness was overwhelming. But then I saw something, a figure barely visible in the shadows near the edge of the trees. It was tall, unnaturally tall, standing perfectly still. I couldn't make out any features, but the silhouette was unmistakable. My stomach churned. I didn't know who or what it was, but it wasn't an animal. I stepped back from the window, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't know what to do. The sounds had stopped, but that figure, whatever it was still there, standing motionless in the dark. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. I wanted to call someone, but there was no signal out here. The nearest town was miles away. I was alone, completely alone. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy iron skillet, and held it in my hands like a weapon. The silence stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity. Then the door creaked open. I didn't hear anyone turn the handle, didn't hear the footsteps on the porch. The door just opened, slowly, as if something had been waiting for it to move. My heart nearly stopped. I could see the dark shape in the doorway, its outline barely visible in the dim light. I didn't know who or what it was, but in that moment, I realized something. The figure in the woods wasn't the only thing that had been watching me. The door was open now, and I had no choice but to face whatever was standing on the other side. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway. Just me, a cabin, and a few days of peace away from everything. I hadn't expected to feel anything other than relief when I saw the small, secluded cabin nestled against the edge of the woods. It wasn't much, rustic, with weathered wood and a little porch that had a few mismatched chairs. But it was all I needed. It wasn't far from a town, just a few miles down a dirt road. I had been looking forward to this time alone. Work had been overwhelming, and I needed space to breathe. I pulled up the gravel driveway, the tires crunching under the weight of the car as I parked near the porch. It was quiet, too quiet. No one was around. No cars, no people, just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. I got out, grabbed my bags from the back seat, and headed inside. The door creaked as I pushed it open. It wasn't locked. The interior was small, dimly lit by the light coming through the dusty windows. The wooden floors were creaky and uneven underfoot. A stone fireplace sat in the far corner, with a couple of old chairs scattered in front. There was a small kitchen area to the left, a table with 2 chairs, and a narrow hallway leading to the bedroom. The place smelled old, like pine wood and something musty, almost like it hadn't been lived in for years. I dropped my bags onto the couch, walked around the place for a few minutes, and found everything in good condition despite the age. The windows weren't cracked, the furniture was solid, and the bedding on the bed seemed clean enough. I decided to take a walk to get a feel for the area. The woods around the cabin looked dense, the trees tall and thick. There were no trails, nothing marked to tell me where I should or shouldn't go. But I didn't mind. I walked around the cabin first, then decided to head down the small path that seemed to cut through the trees toward a small creek. The air was thick with the scent of pine, the earth damp beneath my boots. I followed the sound of running water, the creek louder now as I moved closer. The trees thinned a little, and there was an area where the water pooled into a small, clear pond. It looked peaceful, almost untouched by time. I sat down on a rock by the edge of the water, staring at the reflections of the trees above. The silence around me was deep, almost too deep, like the whole place was holding its breath. It was then that I noticed something strange. There was something off about the edge of the pond. The water was disturbed, just a little, but enough to make me feel uneasy. A small stone, maybe a stick, was moving in the water. It wasn't wind or current. The pond was too still for that. I watched for a moment, my heart beating a little faster, but the movement stopped as suddenly as it started. I stood up, shook my head, and told myself it was nothing. Just an animal, a fish, or the wind. Nothing to worry about. But as I turned to leave, I heard something, like a crack of a twig, barely audible, but enough to make my skin crawl. I froze, my body instinctively tensing. The sound came from deeper in the woods, off to my right. I listened, holding my breath. Nothing, just the wind. I quickly walked back to the cabin, my pace quickening, though I couldn't explain why. There was a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. When I got back to the cabin, I locked the door behind me and went straight to the kitchen to make some coffee. My hands were trembling just a little, but I told myself it was the cold air. That night, the wind picked up. I could hear it howling outside, pressing against the walls of the cabin. The sound of it rattling the windows made the quiet house feel even more isolated. I kept the fire in the fireplace going, trying to focus on the warmth it provided. The flames danced, casting long shadows across the room. I stayed up later than I expected, reading a book by the fire, trying to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. There was nothing out there, just the wind, but my mind kept going back to the movement in the pond, the odd noise in the woods. Around midnight, I started to drift off. That's when I heard it again. Faint knock at the door. I sat up, my heart leaping in my chest. My eyes darted toward the front door. Another knock, this one louder. I stood up slowly, my legs heavy. I didn't know what to do. The rational part of me told me to ignore it. It was probably an animal, maybe something bumping into the door, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I took a deep breath, grabbed a flashlight, and slowly walked toward the door. There was nothing, no one standing outside, just the darkness. I stood there for a moment, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the night. My nerves were on edge, but I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Still, I locked the door again, double-checked the windows, and went back to the couch. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I was being watched. It wasn't the kind of fear you feel when you're being hunted. It was the fear of being alone, deep in the woods with no one around for miles, and something watching, something out there. The next day, I decided to leave. The unease hadn't gone away. I packed my things quickly, moving from room to room, grabbing everything I had brought. When I went to the front door, I paused. I hadn't heard any noises during the night, but something about the place still felt wrong. The wind had died down, but the air felt thick, oppressive. As I stepped outside, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The footprints in the snow leading from the woods right up to the cabin. They weren't animal tracks. They were human. Someone had been watching the cabin. Someone had walked right up to the door, then turned around and left. I stood there for a long time, staring at the prints. My mind raced, but no thoughts made sense. I didn't know who it was or what they wanted. And for the first time, I realized that I hadn't been alone in the woods the whole time. I didn't waste any more time. I grabbed my bags, got into my car, and drove away as fast as I could. The road felt longer on the way back, the silence heavier. Every turn, every shadow in the trees made my heart race. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone following. When I finally reached the town, I didn't stop at the gas station. I didn't stop at the small diner. I kept driving all the way home, as far from that cabin as I could get. I didn't tell anyone what happened, couldn't. But to this day, I can't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. Whoever was watching me, they were still out there, watching from the trees, waiting for the next person who was foolish enough to stay in that cabin.